Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. Jenna Burley's case was at a friend's birthday party, found in a plastic container outside of town. It's difficult to judge a stranger's intentions based solely on their appearance or conversation. Sometimes a stranger may seem perfectly presentable, behave politely, and act at first glance, out of the best intentions, offering help. However, in reality, it's often precisely these individuals who lull their chosen victim into a false sense of security, luring them to a deserted place to rob, kidnap, take advantage of, or end their life. Unfortunately, the victim often realizes too late that they've fallen into a deadly trap. The story of an ordinary American student and popular blogger named Jenna Burley in 2017 shocked the entire country. Initially, thousands of people participated in the search for the missing girl, hoping she was alive. But when the terrifying truth was revealed, no one could believe what had happened. The girl had simply gone to celebrate her friend's birthday, but this party turned out to be the last night of her life. A tragic mix-up, intoxication, and the naive desire to trust a charming stranger who, coincidentally, offered his help led to the tragedy. Who is Jenna Burley? Jenna Nicole Burley was born on November 4, 1994, in the capital of Pennsylvania, the city of Harrisburg, as the second of 4 children to Edward and Jacqueline Burley. Her parents met in the late 80s while attending university in Philadelphia, where mutual feelings quickly blossomed, and they never parted after that. The couple married in the fall of 1991, and in 1992 their first child was born, a daughter named Janelle. 2 years later, the heroine of our story was born, and soon after, their sons, Jeffrey and Jacob, followed one after the other. The Burleys dedicated themselves to helping others. Jacqueline worked in a nursing home, and Edward was employed at a hospital, specializing in patient rehabilitation after injuries and illnesses. The couple raised their children in an atmosphere of love and mutual understanding, striving to give them the best. Jenna was always very close to her parents, as well as her brothers and sister. She grew up as an active, positive, and energetic girl with a creative streak, strong charisma, and leadership qualities. She always had plenty of friends, performed well in school, acted in the school theater from a young age, and adored animals. The Burley family was neither wealthy nor struggling. They settled in Philadelphia, in a spacious house located in the quiet, cozy neighborhood of Harleysville. Jenna easily integrated into any group, quickly made friends, and became the life of the party. In high school, the girl dreamed of becoming a fashion designer, constantly experimenting with looks and styles, sometimes appearing quite extravagant. Jenna wore bright makeup, dyed her hair in various colors, and dressed in different styles, sometimes resembling a hippie, other times an adherent of the emo subculture. She loved standing out from the crowd, and encouraged her friends to challenge the mundane routine as well. The teenage girl frequently attended concerts, festivals, and other mass events that served as sources of inspiration for her. As she neared the end of high school, Burley's views and interests began to shift. Now she dreamed of a career in film rather than fashion design. She learned to create short films during classes at a local film studio, where her talent was already evident as she approached each storyline and creation process with creativity. At that time, Jenna also registered on several social networks where she actively maintained her pages, sharing her life, interests, and philosophical reflections on various pressing social issues. Very quickly, the high school senior gained a large following, and her audience grew rapidly. People seemed to enjoy following this vibrant, creative girl who constantly experimented with her appearance and encouraged others to embrace self-expression. Before she knew it, Jenna had become a rather popular blogger, with an audience of several thousand followers. In 2013, the 18-year-old high school graduate enrolled in a prestigious college in sunny Florida, where she studied media arts and filmmaking. While studying, the student continued to actively maintain and develop her blog, sharing stories about campus life, the subjects she was studying, her community involvement, as well as parties and other entertainment with friends. Serious injury and prolonged depression. On December 20th, 2013, after completing just 1 semester of college, Jenna came home to celebrate Christmas with her family. At that time, Philadelphia had already seen snow, and the weather was quite harsh. Jenna didn't consider the sharp contrast from Florida, and wore completely inappropriate shoes which caused her to slip and fall, seriously injuring her ankle before even reaching the house. An X-ray revealed a double fracture with displacement, requiring surgery, along with the insertion of special pins and plates. For several months, Burley was literally confined to a wheelchair as she couldn't put any weight on her foot. She then had to relearn how to walk and attended daily physiotherapy sessions. During this period, she also managed to catch pneumonia, significantly complicating and prolonging her recovery. The student was forced to take an academic leave to focus on restoring her health, which greatly upset her. The only solace she found was in her personal blog, where she published excerpts from her journal entries and thoughts, and in social media, where Jenna actively communicated with her followers. Jenna posted new videos almost daily, answering questions and discussing various topics. A passionate animal rights activist, she spoke out against zoos, dolphinariums, and other places where animals are kept in captivity and exploited for entertainment. She also highlighted the difficult plight of the homeless, noting that in states with warm and mild climates, they have it much easier than in Pennsylvania, where those without a roof over their heads risk freezing to death on the streets. In addition, Jenna, who had already been engaged in regular charity work, began organizing fundraising efforts to donate essential items to animal shelters and homeless shelters. During her rehabilitation, Jenna took up making handmade jewelry, which she sold online, donating all the proceeds to those in need. She actively encouraged her followers to donate unwanted items to charity, emphasizing that what might seem like trash, cluttering a closet to some, could be a real treasure for someone less fortunate. The recovery period dragged on, and Jenna ended up spending almost a year at home instead of just a few months. During this time, she adopted a dog from a local shelter, whom she absolutely adored, and she mentioned her pet daily in her blog, sharing stories of how they spent their days together. But despite her seemingly optimistic outlook, Jenna fell into a deep depression. In the fall of 2014, she candidly admitted that she could no longer cope on her own and had to seek professional help from a psychiatrist. Burley spoke openly about the mental health challenges she faced, sharing her doctor's recommendations and discussing how her family and pet supported her. The blogger's audience grew several times during this period, as many young people related to the struggles she described and thanked her for her honesty. In early 2015, Jenna, along with her father and younger brother Jacob, went on a trip to sunny California. Jenna felt much better, as she wrote in her social media posts, and the happy photos from the ocean shore clearly showed the strong bond she had with her family. The eternal student. After fully recovering and taking the trip with her family, Jenna decided not to return to Florida, but instead transferred to a school in her hometown, choosing to live at her parents' house. She enrolled at Montgomery County Community College, a suburb of Philadelphia. Meanwhile, Burley continued to maintain her blog and produced short videos on various topics. In 2017, after earning a bachelor's degree in the humanities, Jenna decided to enroll in a university and became a student at Temple University's School of Film. Since the campus was only a half-hour drive away, Jenna chose not to move into a dormitory, but to stay at her family home. By that time, she had renovated her room and acquired her own car, so she didn't need to rely on family members for rides to class. At the time she entered the university, Jenna was already 22 years old, making her 4 to 5 years older than her classmates. Nevertheless, they were on the same wavelength, hanging out, having fun, attending concerts, and celebrating each other's birthdays. It's worth noting that Temple University is located almost in the center of the city and is one of the largest higher education institutions in the country. The campus is surrounded by numerous shops, shopping centers, restaurants, pubs, and other venues. So life here is bustling, you could say, 24/7. Students always have a place to relax and unwind after classes. Classes began at the end of August, and just a few days later, Jenna got into a car accident on her way to school. Fortunately, she was wearing her seatbelt and wasn't injured, but her car was seriously damaged. From then on, her father or one of her younger brothers usually drove her to school in the mornings. Occasionally, Jenna would stay overnight at friends' houses if she stayed in the city late, always informing her parents beforehand. Fatal mix-up at the party. On Wednesday, August 30th, 2017, Jenna's classmate and close friend named Davis was planning to celebrate his birthday at one of the bars. Jenna was among those invited to the party and was supposed to stay overnight at the birthday boy's place so they could head to class together on Thursday morning. She informed her parents in advance, so they wouldn't worry. That evening, Jenna, Davis, and 5 other friends had a great time, taking photos and posting them on social media. They hopped from bar to bar, meeting other friends along the way who joined their group, congratulating the birthday boy and toasting to his health. By around 11 p.m., the group had changed significantly, and everyone was pretty tipsy. Around midnight, the friends found themselves in a small sports bar that was packed with people. The birthday boy had stepped away because his friends had arranged a surprise for him, kidnapping him and taking him to another venue. He informed Burley about this and asked her to text him what time she would arrive at his apartment to spend the night. Jenna stayed in the bar with the rest of the group. Several people who were sober and driving offered Jenna a ride wherever she wanted to go, and a few classmates invited her to stay over at their place. But Jenna said she had already made plans with Davis and would go to his place. However, by around 1 a.m., friends began to leave, and Burley didn't notice that everyone who had offered her a place to stay or a ride had simply disappeared. A mix-up occurred, leading to tragic consequences. Jenna believed until the last moment that she would leave with someone from the bar, and she said goodbye to her friends, assuring them that she would stay a little longer. When she finally realized what was happening, she was sitting at the bar next to a group of strangers who soon left as well. The bar was closing at 2 a.m., and Jenna, realizing she was all alone, started texting Davis, asking him to come pick her up. However, the guy had fallen asleep at home, and his phone was in another room, so he didn't hear anything. Jenna tried to contact a few other friends, but they were either too drunk to respond or didn't hear their phones. She didn't want to bother her parents, and walking through the city alone at night didn't seem safe. The disappearance of the student. When Davis woke up in the morning, he thought Jenna had stayed over at someone else's place, but after checking his phone, he became seriously concerned. Jenna had tried to call him twice and sent several messages asking if he could pick her up from the bar, with the last message containing only 2 words, "Help me." He tried to call her back, but her phone was turned off. He still hoped that his friend was okay and would show up at class as usual. But Burley never appeared at the university. Davis called and visited all the friends who had partied with them at the bar the night before, but none of them had hosted the student. In the afternoon, one of Jenna's friends called her parents to ask if she had returned home. When they responded no, she explained what had happened, and within half an hour, Edward and Jacqueline rushed to the campus. They spoke with their daughter's friends, trying to find out who had seen her last and where. After getting no useful information, the Burleys immediately went to the police to report their daughter missing, insisting on an immediate search operation. The urgency of the situation was heightened by the messages asking for help that Jenna had sent to several classmates. The first places checked were the academic buildings and dormitories, but there was no sign of the missing student. The police then contacted local hospitals, but no women matching Jenna's description had been admitted in the past 24 hours. Everyone who had interacted with her the previous night confirmed that the last time they saw the student was at the sports bar. She was wearing blue jeans, a white t-shirt with a motivational slogan on the front, and a light blue hoodie tied around her waist. Another distinguishing feature was her hairstyle. Long black hair braided into 2 pigtails. Since Burley was a fairly popular blogger, news of her disappearance quickly spread across social media. Thousands of her followers posted messages asking for help in finding her and urged anyone with information to come forward. The generous and persistent stranger. When the police arrived at the bar where the missing student was last seen, the bartender immediately remembered the girl with the braids who stayed late after everyone else had left. She was quite drunk, seemed confused, and was constantly texting and calling someone. The signal from her phone was last detected in the same neighborhood around 2 a.m. Surveillance footage from the cameras at the entrance and inside the bar was reviewed. The detectives saw Jenna sitting alone at the bar, drinking a cocktail and sending messages. Around 1:30 a.m., a man approached her, started a conversation, and then bought her a drink. They sat together for about 20 minutes before leaving the bar just before it closed. They both appeared to be quite intoxicated as they were walking unsteadily. When the bartender was shown the footage and asked if he knew the man, he immediately recognized a regular customer and even named him Joshua Huperters. According to the bartender, Joshua was almost a daily visitor, and the night before he seemed particularly interested in the lonely beauty, buying her cocktails and persistently inviting her to his place. The authorities discovered that Joshua had recently turned 29, had once attended Temple University but never graduated, having taken an extended academic leave. Despite this, He constantly hung out with students and lived just 5 minutes away from the bar where he was seen with Jenna. He rented a spacious apartment in a building across the street, which he shared with his friend Jack Miley. It wasn't until later in the evening that they managed to reach Joshua, who claimed he had been very drunk the night before and didn't remember anything about a girl from the bar. He agreed to come in for questioning, but soon after, his phone was turned off, prompting the police to visit Huperter's apartment themselves. The main suspect. Only Jack was home, and he let the detectives in without any fuss. The guy's apartment looked like a typical bachelor pad, with disorder reigning in nearly every room. Jack admitted that he and his friend had indeed gone to the sports bar the night before, where they drank heavily. Afterward, Joshua picked up some girl, and Jack decided to head home to give them privacy. Jack claimed he went straight to bed and didn't hear when his roommate came home, or if he was alone. The next day, Joshua suddenly started cleaning the kitchen. He seemed worried, had fresh scratches on his face, and a deep cut on his hand. Joshua explained this as an unfortunate accident, saying he had fallen into some bushes while drunk. After lunch, he disappeared, taking some of his belongings with him without telling his friend where he was going or how long he'd be gone, and his phone was turned off. The large apartment the guys lived in had a second exit leading to the backyard where there were no surveillance cameras. Near the door, a pair of men's sandals with strange brownish stains were found, and on a dresser lay a roll of paper towels, stained with something that looked like blood. There was also a strong smell of cleaning chemicals in the kitchen, and several empty bottles of cleaning products were scattered on the floor. All of this raised alarming suspicions, and from that point on, Joshua was considered the main suspect in the case of the missing student. The police decided to dig deeper into Huperter's background and discovered that he was born and raised in Philadelphia, lost his father at an early age, who had been violently deprived of life, and this event had been traumatic for the child. Joshua enrolled at Temple University but never graduated, remaining a student until he was 29. He had a history of legal issues related to the distribution of prohibited substances which he sold to students. He had served several months for burglary and had been charged multiple times for assaults on women in attempts to coerce them into intimacy. The search and first interrogation of the fugitive. It became clear that the suspect could be extremely dangerous, and there was still no information about the fate of the missing girl. The FBI joined the investigation, and soon it was determined that Joshua's phone had last been active in Wayne County, about 230 miles north of Philadelphia, near a lake. It was discovered that the fugitive's grandmother lived in that area, and he might be hiding at her house. Hupper was indeed apprehended at his maternal grandmother's house. He appeared calm and didn't resist. He maintained that he didn't remember anything about the night of August 31st because he was drunk, and when asked about the fresh wounds on his body, he repeated the same story about falling into bushes that he had told his roommate, Jack. He explained his sudden departure as wanting to spend the last weekend before the start of classes with family. When the police pointed out that they knew he wasn't enrolled in any university, he fell silent and demanded a lawyer. Meanwhile, experts working at the fugitive's apartment in Philadelphia found traces of blood on the floor, plumbing, and in the trash can. They were waiting for the test results to determine whose blood it was, and the hope of finding the missing girl alive was fading with each passing minute. During the search of Joshua's room, several bags of various prohibited substances were found, along with about $20,000 in cash. The mysterious container. Detectives continued to search Huperter's residence, including the backyard accessible through the second door. In the corner trash bins, which fortunately had not yet been emptied, a black bag was found containing a light blue hoodie and a t-shirt with slogans, along with a sports bra and a black hair tie with a few dark strands of hair. The clothing found in the trash closely resembled what Jenna was wearing on the day she disappeared. To make matters worse, there were blood stains on the items, making the chances of finding the girl alive seem almost non-existent. Nevertheless, the search continued and the suspect remained silent. On September 2nd, Huperter's stepfather unexpectedly called the police, reporting that on August 31st, the man had visited his mother's house in Jenkinsone. He had arrived by taxi carrying a large opaque plastic container that was very heavy. Joshua explained that it contained his books and some personal belongings. He left the container in the garage and left early the next morning, taking another taxi. The stepfather found this suspicious, as the container was unusually heavy and gave off a strange feeling. Knowing his stepson's criminal past, the elderly man decided to inform the police without telling his wife. He didn't know where Joshua went afterward, but heard him asking the driver not to log the trip in the app, promising to pay in cash. By the time the stepfather called, Hooper Tertz had already been apprehended, and a search of his grandmother's house had yielded no suspicious findings. The fate of the mysterious plastic container remained unknown, and the authorities suspected it might have been sunk in a lake. They considered involving divers in the search, but the case took an unexpected turn. It turned out that Joshua's grandmother's husband had a small shed located a significant distance from the house, nearly hidden by overgrown bushes and trees. The man stored an old boat and fishing gear there, though he hadn't used them in a long time. On September 3rd, he decided to check the shed and noticed the lock on the door was broken. Suspecting thieves, he entered but found everything in its place, except for a strange container that hadn't been there before. He opened the container and recoiled in horror. It was the severely mutilated naked body of a young woman. He immediately called the police to report the gruesome discovery. The authorities quickly realized whose remains the pensioner had found in his shed and called in Burley's parents for identification. Jenna's mother fainted, and her father nearly had a heart attack when their worst fears were confirmed. Crime scene. Through witness testimony and surveillance footage, investigators established that Hooper Tertz had plied the already intoxicated girl with more alcohol and then lured her to his home. When Jenna realized she was trapped, she managed to send several friends messages asking for help, but none responded. At the apartment, Joshua attacked the girl and tried to force her into intimacy, but she fought back fiercely, scratching the criminal and cutting his hand with a kitchen knife. However, he managed to knock the knife out of her hand and repeatedly slammed her head against the floor. He incapacitated Jenna and took advantage of her before strangling the poor girl with his bare hands. He then placed her body in a container he found in the storage room and cleaned up the crime scene as best he could. The autopsy revealed that Jenna died from mechanical asphyxiation. Her body showed numerous abrasions, bruises, and even bite marks. She also had a traumatic brain injury and signs of intimate assault. The blood found on the shoes and paper towels in the apartment was hers. Her hair was on the hair tie in the trash can, and the blood and semen found on her clothing matched the defendant's. Trial and sentencing. Hupperters refused to take a plea deal or admit guilt, even though his culpability was never in doubt. Furthermore, a search of his grandmother's house revealed a backpack containing his documents, cash, and a few essentials indicating that the criminal had intended to flee and was caught just in time. The trial of the criminal and assailant began only in the spring of 2019, a year and a half after the horrific crime. The defense attorneys desperately tried to shift all the blame onto the deceased girl, claiming that she had voluntarily come to Joshua's apartment and provoked him. However, the defense's statements sparked outrage among everyone present. After 9 days of hearings, the defendant was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole only after 60 years. Story 2. The cold drizzle hung in the air over Amsterdam like a thin, relentless veil, muting the vibrant colors of the city's canals and cobblestone streets into a monotonous gray. It was early November of 2023, and the usual bustle of tourists had thinned out with the onset of winter's grip, leaving the city's quieter, darker corners to reclaim their dominion. In the heart of the city, nestled between a rundown cafe and an antique bookshop, stood a narrow, unassuming doorway with a peeling red paint job, barely noticeable to the casual passerby. This was the entrance to a small, discreet office belonging to the notorious private investigator, Max van Dyck, a man whose reputation had grown over the past decade from solving petty thefts to unraveling intricate criminal webs that entangled the underworld of the Netherlands. Max was a tall, lean man in his late 30s, with sharp eyes that never missed the slightest detail, framed by a mop of unruly dark hair streaked with premature gray. His office smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper, with stacks of case files and newspapers scattered across every surface. On this dreary morning, Max was poring over a new file, a case unlike any he had handled before. It involved a string of high-profile art thefts that had shaken Amsterdam's cultural scene to its core. Priceless paintings, centuries-old sculptures, and rare artifacts had disappeared from some of the city's most secure museums and private collections, leaving the police baffled and the media desperate for answers. The most recent theft had taken place just 3 days earlier at the Rijksmuseum, where an exquisite Rembrandt had vanished during a brief power outage. No alarms had been triggered, no signs of forced entry found, and the few security guards on duty were adamant they had seen nothing suspicious. The police were at a loss, and the museum's director was on the verge of a public breakdown. Max's client, a wealthy art collector named Anouk Vermeer, had approached him with a desperate plea to find her missing masterpiece, which had been stolen alongside the Rembrandt in the same daring heist. Unlike the police, Max suspected this was no ordinary crime. He believed it was the work of a mastermind who was playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse. As Max sifted through witness statements and surveillance footage, one name kept surfacing, a shadowy figure known only as the Alchemist. Rumored to be a former art restorer turned criminal genius, the Alchemist was said to have an uncanny ability to bypass security systems and erase all traces of his presence. His motives were unclear. Some whispered he was collecting stolen art to create a secret gallery hidden deep beneath the city, while others believed he was orchestrating a complex revenge against the elite who had betrayed him years ago. Max knew that finding the Alchemist would be like chasing a ghost, but the stakes were too high to turn away. Later that afternoon, Max decided to visit one of his old contacts, Lena, a street-smart informant who ran a bar in the red light district and had her ear to the ground when it came to underground dealings. The bar was a dimly lit, smoky haven for criminals and artists alike, where whispered deals were made behind thick curtains and secrets slipped as easily as the drinks. Lena greeted Max with a wary smile, her sharp eyes flicking to the file in his hand. "You're chasing shadows again, aren't you?" she asked, pouring him a glass of cheap whiskey. "I'm chasing a ghost who's been stealing ghosts," Max replied grimly. "The Alchemist is real, Lena. And he's got a new target." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've heard talk of a shipment arriving tomorrow night at the docks. Something big, something priceless. If it's true, it's our best lead." Max nodded, knowing that the docks at night were a labyrinth of containers, warehouses, and shadowy figures who lived on the fringes of the law. It was a dangerous place, but it was where he would have to go if he wanted to get closer to the truth. As dusk fell, Max prepared for his nocturnal stakeout. He dressed in dark clothing, his worn leather jacket blending into the night as he slipped quietly through the winding alleys toward the IJ River docks. The cold bit into his skin, but his mind was focused and alert. He knew he wasn't just risking failure. In a city like Amsterdam, where past sins often cast long shadows, crossing the wrong people could mean a fate far worse than defeat. The docks were already alive with activity, crates being unloaded, trucks roaring to life, and men moving in hurried, nervous bursts. Max melted into the background, watching and waiting. Hours passed with no sign of anything unusual, until finally a sleek black van pulled up near an unmarked warehouse. Two men, faces obscured by scarves and hats, quickly unloaded a series of heavy crates. Max's heart pounded as he recognized the unmistakable markings on one of the crates, the emblem of the Amsterdam Art Foundation, an organization responsible for some of the most valuable collections in the city. Someone was smuggling stolen art right under the police's nose. Without thinking, Max pulled out his phone to snap a few photos, but a sudden noise behind him made him freeze. A low voice hissed from the shadows, "You shouldn't be here." Max turned slowly to see a figure emerge from the darkness, tall, lean, and wearing a leather jacket much like his own. The stranger's eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating light. "I'm nobody," Max said evenly. "Just a man looking for answers." The figure smiled thinly. "In this city, answers come with a price." Before Max could react, the stranger slipped back into the shadows, leaving a chilling silence behind. Shaken but undeterred, Max knew the game had just changed. The Alchemist wasn't just a myth. He was a player with a plan, and Max was now trapped on the board, a pawn caught in a deadly puzzle that would take him to the darkest corners of the city and beyond. Tomorrow, the chase would begin in earnest. But for now, the cold wind and the distant hum of the city reminded Max that in Amsterdam, even the brightest lights cast the longest shadows. The morning after the stakeout dawned gray and cold, the mist still clinging to the canals as if trying to hide the city's secrets beneath a fragile shroud. Max returned to his office, the weight of last night's encounter pressing heavily on his mind. The stranger's warning echoed in his thoughts. Answers come with a price. He had a feeling that price was about to be paid in full. As he sifted through the photographs he had taken, Max noticed something unsettling. One of the crates bore a faint, almost invisible code etched into the wood. It was a cipher he had seen before, buried deep in the archives of old Dutch resistance codes from World War II. Could it be a message from the Alchemist, or a clue left behind intentionally? Determined to decode the message, Max called an old friend and cryptographer, Peter, who was known for his eccentric brilliance and a knack for puzzles. Peter's cramped apartment was cluttered with ancient books, computer parts, and strange gadgets that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a modern-day study. When Max showed him the photos, Peter's eyes lit up with excitement. "This is no ordinary code," he said, tracing the faint marks with his finger. "It's a layered cipher, one used to conceal not just information but locations. If the alchemist is clever enough to use this, he's planning something big." With Peter's help, Max began to unravel the coded message, a complex string of numbers and symbols that pointed to several key landmarks across Amsterdam: the old maritime museum, a forgotten subway tunnel beneath the city, and a derelict factory on the outskirts of town. Each location seemed random, but Max sensed they formed a map, a trail leading to whatever the alchemist was hiding. The detective knew he had to act fast. The longer he waited, the more time the alchemist had to slip away. Max decided to start with the Maritime Museum, a place he knew well from his childhood. The museum was housed in a grand old building on the waterfront, filled with relics of Dutch naval history. It was popular with tourists by day, but virtually deserted after closing time. As he slipped inside through a service door left carelessly ajar, Max's footsteps echoed in the cavernous hall. The scent of aged wood and salt water filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of security cameras. He moved carefully, eyes scanning for anything out of place. Behind a massive model of a 17th century ship, Max discovered a narrow hatch leading down to a hidden basement. The air was damp and stale, thick with dust and the scent of forgotten years. Illuminated only by his flashlight, Max descended into the darkness. The walls were lined with crates similar to those he had seen at the docks, and in the center of the room lay a large canvas, draped in a heavy tarp. He pulled it back slowly, revealing an unfinished painting, a hauntingly beautiful portrait that seemed to shift and change in the flickering light. It was a work by a long-lost Dutch master, rumored to have been destroyed during the war. As Max examined the painting, he heard footsteps above. He ducked behind a stack of crates, just as two men entered the basement. They spoke in hushed tones about the shipment, the timing, and the next move. Max strained to listen, catching snippets of a plan to auction the stolen art to an exclusive group of collectors willing to pay fortunes for pieces that never saw the light of day. He also heard the name Latte, a mysterious woman connected to the alchemist, whose role seemed pivotal but elusive. Max knew he couldn't confront the men directly. Instead, he slipped back into the shadows and made his way out of the museum, heart pounding with the urgency of the knowledge he now possessed. The trail was leading him deeper into the underworld, a tangled web of greed, betrayal, and revenge. He thought of Anouk Vermeer, whose desperation had brought him into this deadly game, and wondered if she truly understood what she had unleashed. The next stop was the subway tunnel, an eerie labyrinth of graffiti-covered walls and flickering fluorescent lights. Max moved cautiously, every sound amplified in the stillness underground. As he ventured further, he discovered a hidden chamber where the alchemist's signature appeared again, scrawled in cryptic symbols along the walls. It was a message meant for those who knew how to read it, a warning that this was only the beginning. In the darkness, Max felt the weight of the city's history pressing down on him. A history of resistance, survival, and secrets buried beneath centuries of stone and water. He realized that the alchemist was not just stealing art. He was rewriting a story, one that blurred the lines between criminal and artist, thief and savior. That night, as the city settled into uneasy quiet, Max sat alone in his office, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each revelation. Outside, the canals reflected the dim glow of street lamps, their still waters hiding the restless currents beneath. Max knew he was chasing more than stolen paintings. He was chasing shadows of a past that refused to stay buried, and a future that could shatter the fragile peace of Amsterdam forever. The night air was crisp and sharp as Max made his way toward the derelict factory on the outskirts of Amsterdam, the final location indicated by the cipher. The streets grew quieter, the glow of the city fading behind him as he entered an industrial zone where rusted machinery and broken windows told tales of decay and neglect. The factory loomed ahead like a forgotten giant, its once proud walls cracked and graffiti-streaked, its purpose lost to time. Yet tonight, it held a secret that might finally unravel the alchemist's grand design. Max slipped through a gap in the rusted chain-link fence and moved cautiously toward the main entrance. Inside, the cavernous space was dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows that danced across piles of discarded equipment and crates stacked high with dust. The scent of oil and metal hung heavy, mixing with the faint aroma of paint thinner, a subtle reminder of the art that had been smuggled here. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he approached a hidden door beneath a staircase, the very place Peter's decoded map had hinted at. As he pushed the door open, Max found himself in a secret gallery, a surreal and eerie sanctuary of stolen masterpieces, each one painstakingly restored and displayed as if in a twisted museum curated by the alchemist himself. The walls were lined with canvases that seemed to whisper the city's darkest stories, stolen Rembrandts, Van Goghs, and lesser-known Dutch gems glowing under soft, deliberate lighting. The air was thick with the weight of stolen beauty and unspoken vengeance. Then, from the shadows, a soft voice broke the silence. "Welcome, Max Van Dyke." Emerging from the darkness was Latte, the mysterious woman Max had heard whispered about, poised and elegant, with eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. She was the alchemist's right hand, perhaps even more. "You've come far," she said, her tone equal parts admiration and warning. "But this isn't just about theft. It's about justice, about reclaiming what was lost from history, from the people who were forgotten or betrayed." Max's gaze hardened. "Justice doesn't come from stealing, Latte. It comes from facing the truth." He took a step forward, wary but determined. "What's your real plan? Why all this?" Latte smiled, almost sadly. "The art world is a lie, a playground for the wealthy to hide their sins behind gilded frames. The alchemist is dismantling that illusion, piece by piece. These paintings are not just objects, they are stories stolen by greed and silence. We're giving them back to the people on our terms." Before Max could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the factory. Police lights flashed outside, reflecting through broken windows. Somehow, the authorities had found the location. Latte's expression flickered, and she whispered, "You have to decide, Max, walk away, or become part of this story." Max felt the weight of the moment settle, like a stone in his gut. He had chased shadows, decoded secrets, and come face to face with a truth more complicated than any case he'd ever solved. But he wasn't about to let a city's treasures disappear into the night, no matter the reasons. With a steady breath, Max reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, ready to send the coordinates to the police. But before he could press send, Latte stepped closer and said softly, "There's still time to choose differently. Sometimes justice wears many faces." The room tensed, the air thick with possibility. In that fleeting moment, Max understood that the line between criminal and hero was blurred by perspective, and that the story he had uncovered was far from over. But whatever choices lay ahead, he knew one thing. Amsterdam's shadows held more secrets than anyone dared imagine, and the city would never be the same. As the police stormed the building, Max's eyes met Latte's one last time. In that gaze was a silent acknowledgement, a promise that their paths, and the art's fate, were entwined in a way neither could yet foresee. The case was closed for now, but Max Van Dyke knew this was only the beginning of a deeper, darker game. The city's canals reflected the first light of dawn, shimmering with the promise of truth hidden beneath the surface, a truth that Max was determined to find, no matter the cost. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. The rain fell steadily over Amsterdam, turning the cobblestone streets into slick mirrors reflecting the flickering glow of the gas lamps. The city, always a labyrinth of narrow alleys and winding canals, felt heavier tonight, as if the damp air itself was thick with secrets. Detective Emma Voss stood beneath the awning of a rundown cafe, watching the rain blur the figures passing by, each step splashing on the rain-soaked pavement. She pulled her coat tighter against the chill, the damp seeping into her bones despite the warmth inside. It had been 3 days since the body was found, sprawled on the damp bricks near the Bloemenmarkt, the famous floating flower market. The victim was a young man, mid-20s, his identity unknown but for a single clue. A rare coin clutched tightly in his hand, one that belonged to a secret society, rumored to operate in the shadows of Amsterdam's underworld. Emma was no stranger to the darker corners of the city. Years on the force had taught her how to read between the lines, how to catch the subtleties hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. But this case was different. The coin was not just a piece of currency, it was a key, or a warning. It pointed to a web of crime and corruption that stretched far beyond the usual petty thefts and drug deals. Rumors whispered of a syndicate known only as the Tulip Order, a clandestine group pulling strings behind closed doors, manipulating art trades, smuggling, and political favors. To get close meant risking everything, and Emma felt that risk pressing harder with every step she took. The rain eased slightly as Emma crossed the bridge over the canal, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet night. Her phone buzzed, a message from her partner, Jeroen. Found something. Meet at the station ASAP. She quickened her pace, heart pounding not just from the chill but from the growing tension that gripped her chest. Back at headquarters, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Jeroen spread out a series of photographs and documents on the table. This coin, he said, pointing to a close-up image, was minted in 1648, the year the Dutch Republic was officially recognized after the 80 Years' War. But it's not just the date, it's the engraving on the back. Look here. He circled a tiny symbol, a tulip intertwined with a dagger. Emma frowned. The tulip. That fits with the order, right? Exactly. And there's more. We traced the coin's recent history through private collectors. It resurfaced 2 weeks ago in an auction that was abruptly canceled. The auction house owner vanished overnight. It's like someone wanted this coin to disappear. A chill ran down Emma's spine. The deeper they dug, the darker the story became. The tulip order was known to guard its secrets fiercely, and violence had a way of following those who dared pry too close. Emma glanced at the photos of the victim again, trying to piece together who he was and why he had ended up dead clutching that coin. She noticed a faint tattoo on his wrist, a series of numbers and letters that looked like a coded message. Jeroen pulled out a laptop and started running the numbers through a cryptographic program they had used on past cases. If this is a cipher, it could be coordinates, names, or dates, something meant to lead us to the next step. Hours passed as the two detectives worked through the night, the glow of the computer screen casting sharp shadows on their tired faces. Emma's mind wandered to the city outside, where the rain had stopped but the streets remained empty and watchful, as if Amsterdam itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in those silent canals, secrets swirled like the currents beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Just before dawn, a breakthrough came. The code translated into an address, a forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of the city, near the old docks that had long been abandoned after years of industrial decline. Emma and Jeroen exchanged a glance heavy with unspoken understanding. This was where the next piece of the puzzle awaited, and it might not welcome them with open arms. By the time they arrived, the sky was streaked with the faint blush of morning light. The warehouse stood cold and silent, its windows boarded up and the heavy door sealed shut with rusted chains. Emma's fingers brushed the cold metal of her service pistol as they approached cautiously. The scent of salt water mixed with the stale air inside, and every creak of the floorboards echoed in the cavernous space. Inside, they found evidence of recent activity, tire tracks in the dirt, footprints in the dust, and scattered remnants of what looked like packing materials. On one wall, hastily scrawled in red paint, was a message: "Trust no one." Emma's eyes narrowed. The warning was clear. The tulip order was watching, and they were dangerous. Then, amidst the debris, Emma spotted something else, a ledger, thick with pages and filled with names, dates, and transactions in a code that suggested money laundering and illicit trades. It was a map of the order's network, a treasure trove of information that could bring down powerful people. But with that knowledge came the peril of exposure. As the morning sun broke through the warehouse's grimy windows, Emma knew their hunt was only beginning. The city outside stirred to life, unaware that beneath its peaceful facade, a shadow war was unfolding, one that could change Amsterdam forever. The weight of the ledger felt heavier than its worn leather cover as Emma carried it carefully back to the station, each step echoing louder in the early morning stillness. It was more than just a book. It was a gateway into the clandestine world of the Tulip Order, a criminal network that had evaded law enforcement for decades, operating in the shadows with an almost untouchable grip on the city's political and economic veins. The names listed in the ledger were a who's who of Amsterdam's elite, from politicians to businessmen, all connected by silent deals and hidden agendas. Emma could almost hear the quiet pulse of corruption vibrating through those pages, each entry a thread tying powerful players to a sprawling conspiracy of smuggling, blackmail, and money laundering. As the day unfolded, Emma and Jeroen convened a small, trusted team to begin unraveling the tangled web that the ledger exposed. The atmosphere in the cramped interrogation room was thick with tension and urgency, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead blending with the low murmur of voices exchanging theories and leads. They had no time to waste. Someone within the city's elite was surely watching, ready to silence any threat to their carefully constructed facade. Emma's gut told her this was no ordinary case. It was a battle for the soul of Amsterdam itself, waged beneath the surface of canals and cobblestones. Hours later, a breakthrough came when an encrypted message was intercepted from one of the contacts listed in the ledger. It referenced a meeting at a secluded estate outside the city, scheduled for the coming night. Emma knew this could be their chance to catch a key figure in the Order's hierarchy. But it also meant walking directly into the lion's den. The estate was a sprawling manor hidden by tall hedges and guarded by more security than Emma had ever seen outside a government facility. Yet, the promise of answers outweighed the danger. That evening, cloaked by darkness and the mist rising from the canals, Emma and Jeroen approached the estate in an unmarked car, their faces set with grim determination. The estate's gates opened silently as if expecting them, and they slipped inside, shadows among shadows. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and expensive cigars, an eerie contrast to the grim purpose that brought them here. Inside, the grand hall echoed with murmurs of wealth and power, a gathering of men and women whose polite smiles masked ruthless ambition. Emma's eyes scanned the crowd, each figure a potential threat or a key to unraveling the Order's secrets. At the center stood a man known only as Vandermeer, a name whispered with both respect and fear in Amsterdam's darkest circles. Rumored to be the mastermind behind the Order's recent expansion, he was charismatic yet cold, his presence commanding attention and loyalty. Tonight, Emma was not just an outsider. She was a silent observer in a den of vipers. Suddenly, the room shifted as Vandermeer stepped forward, raising a glass and a toast. His voice was smooth, almost hypnotic. "To the future of Amsterdam," he said, "and to those who understand the true value of power and discretion." The crowd echoed the sentiment, glasses clinking like the ticking of a clock counting down to inevitable reckoning. Emma's pulse quickened. This was their moment. But before she could move, a hand gripped her shoulder, Jeroen's whisper sharp and urgent. "We're compromised. Someone knows we're here." Panic flashed through her mind. The elegant facade of the gathering suddenly seemed like a cage closing in. Vandermeer's eyes met hers from across the room, a flicker of recognition and menace that sent a chill down her spine. Escape was no longer a choice. Confrontation was inevitable. Chaos erupted as hidden doors swung open and armed men poured in, the once civil gathering transforming into a battleground. Emma's training kicked in as she ducked behind a heavy mahogany table, her pistol drawn and heart racing. Shots echoed, mingling with shattered glass and screams. In that moment, the true nature of the Tulip Order revealed itself, ruthless, unrelenting, and willing to kill to protect its secrets. Amid the frenzy, Emma caught sight of a figure slipping toward the back exit. Vandermeer himself, his calm shattered only by the urgency of flight. Without hesitation, she gave chase, crashing through the sprawling gardens, the cold night air biting at her face. The chase twisted through hedgerows and stone statues, the distant sound of sirens growing louder as backup raced toward the scene. Finally, Vandermeer stumbled near the edge of a canal, cornered and desperate. His face was a mask of defiance and fear as Emma leveled her pistol, demanding answers. "Who's behind this?" she shouted, her voice steady despite the chaos. "What is the Tulip Order really after?" He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You think this ends with me? We are the veins through which Amsterdam breathes. Without us, the city chokes on its own hypocrisy. You can't stop what's already in motion." Before Emma could respond, he slipped a small device from his pocket and pressed a button. A blinding flash erupted, disorienting her, and in the confusion, Vandermeer vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only questions and the weight of a conspiracy far deeper than she had imagined. As the sirens approached and the storm of violence settled, Emma stood by the canal's edge, the ledger still clutched in her hand, knowing that the fight was far from over. The city she loved was caught in a web of shadows and lies, and it was up to her to untangle them, no matter the cost. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. Amsterdam's gray skies hung low, casting a dull light over the city's winding canals and historic brick buildings. The city was calm on the surface, but beneath the peaceful veneer, a storm was brewing, one that would shake the very foundations of the city's underworld. Detective Lars de Vries stood on the edge of the Adezid's Achterbergwal Canal, staring down at the murky water where the body had been found just hours earlier. The victim, a middle-aged man with no identification, had been discovered by a passerby, his hands bound and face bruised, drowned in the cold depths of the canal. There was something unusual about this case, something that didn't fit the pattern of Amsterdam's usual street crime. Lars felt it in his gut, a knot tightening as he considered the implications. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a message. The first clue was the symbol carved crudely into the victim's wrist, a small, stylized lion, the emblem of an infamous crime syndicate operating out of Rotterdam, but spreading like wildfire across the country. The syndicate was known as the Lurk, or the Lion, a ruthless organization controlling drug trafficking, human smuggling, and illegal arms deals with a cold, calculating efficiency that made them nearly untouchable. The carving was a brand, either a mark of ownership or a warning to those who crossed them. Lars knew that finding out which could mean the difference between solving the case and becoming the next target. Back at the precinct, the sterile walls seemed to close in on Lars as he sifted through files and photographs. The victim remained a mystery. No missing persons reports matched his description, no fingerprints in the national database. But the deeper Lars dug, the more he uncovered a web of deceit stretching from Amsterdam's red light district to the warehouses along the North Sea coast. Rumors swirled of a planned smuggling operation, so large it could flood the market with drugs and weapons, destabilizing the fragile peace the city had maintained. And right at the heart of it all was a name Lars had heard whispered in shadowy conversations: Willem the Fox Jansen, a cunning and elusive kingpin rumored to have ties to corrupt officials and international crime networks. Lars knew that to get to the bottom of this, he had to play a dangerous game, one that would force him to walk a tightrope between justice and survival. His partner, Annika, had warned him to be careful. "The Lurk doesn't play fair, Lars. They'll come after you and everyone you care about," she said, her eyes sharp but worried. But Lars was already past the point of turning back. He had lost too much to let fear dictate his actions. The city was his home, and he was determined to tear down the criminal empire hiding in its shadows, no matter the cost. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when Annika received a tip from an informant deep inside the syndicate's ranks. A young man scared enough to risk his life for a chance at freedom. He revealed that the Lurk was planning a major shipment, a cargo moving through the port under the cover of night. If Lars and Annika could intercept it, they might finally have the evidence needed to bring down the organization. But the operation was heavily guarded, with mercenaries armed to the teeth and the constant threat of betrayal lurking in every corner. Under the cover of darkness, Lars and Annika prepared for their raid, coordinating with a small team of trusted officers. The air was thick with tension as they approached the docks, the smell of salt water mingling with diesel and rust. The faint hum of machinery and distant shouts echoed across the empty piers, broken only by the rhythmic lapping of waves against the hulls of moored ships. They moved silently, shadows slipping between containers stacked like monoliths in the moonlight. Every step was measured, every breath held in anticipation. Suddenly, floodlights snapped on, casting harsh beams that sliced through the darkness, and armed guards poured out from hiding places, weapons raised and voices shouting orders. The raid exploded into chaos, gunfire ringing out, metal clashing, and the frantic scramble of men fighting for control. Lars and Annika ducked behind crates, returning fire while shouting commands into their radios. The violence was sudden and brutal, a clash of wills between law enforcement and the criminal machine that refused to be dismantled. Amid the gunfire, Lars caught sight of a figure darting through the maze of containers. A man wearing a distinctive red scarf, the telltale sign of one of the Lurk's top lieutenants. Without hesitation, Lars gave chase, weaving through the labyrinth with adrenaline sharpening his senses. The lieutenant was fast, but Lars's determination was fiercer. Near the edge of the dock, where the water glittered like broken glass under the moonlight, Lars tackled the man to the ground, wrestling him into submission. With handcuffs clicking shut, Lars barked questions, demanding the truth behind the shipment and the identity of those pulling the strings. The lieutenant's defiant sneer faltered as Lars revealed the evidence they had gathered: a ledger, coded messages, and intercepted calls implicating high-ranking officials in a sprawling conspiracy. The truth was worse than Lars had imagined. The criminal network had penetrated deeper into the city's fabric than anyone dared admit, blurring the line between law and lawlessness. As dawn broke over Amsterdam, the city awoke unaware of the battle fought in its shadows, the criminals caught in the web of justice Lars and Annika had spun. But the war was far from over. The syndicate would retaliate, and Lars knew that every victory came with a price. He looked out over the canals, the first rays of sunlight glinting off the water, steeling himself for the battles yet to come. In a city built on history and secrets, the fight for truth was never finished. The morning sun crept over Amsterdam's rooftops, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets as Detective Lars de Vries sat in the precinct's interrogation room, the fading adrenaline of the raid settling into a cold determination. The lieutenant they had captured, a wiry man named Eric Voss, sat across from him, eyes darting nervously but masking a stubborn defiance. Lars studied him closely, knowing that this man was a key to unlocking the tangled operations of Delu, yet also aware that every word could be a trap. "You know what happens if you lie," Lars said quietly, the weight of years on the force lending his voice a steely edge. Eric's silence stretched for a moment before he spoke, voice low and cautious. "You don't understand what you're up against. Delu is everywhere. They have eyes in the city, in the government. If you want to survive, you'd better watch your back." Lars felt the chill of those words sink in. The corruption ran deeper than he feared, and the criminal empire was intertwined with the very institutions meant to protect the city. Annika's warnings echoed in his mind. Trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Yet, despite the danger, there was no turning away from the path they had chosen. The ledger seized in the raid was already revealing new layers of the conspiracy, coded transactions, mysterious aliases, and references to shadowy figures whose names never appeared in public records. This was a war fought in whispers and secrets, and every piece of evidence brought Lars closer to the heart of a darkness that threatened to consume Amsterdam. The day dragged on with a flurry of activity, interrogations, surveillance setups, and urgent calls to contacts in the intelligence community. Lars and Annika worked side by side, the weight of responsibility pressing down on them, but the fire of resolve burning brighter. It was late afternoon when an anonymous tip came in, directing them to a decrepit warehouse near the outskirts of the city, a place long abandoned but rumored to be a hub for illegal transactions. The team moved quickly, knowing this could be another trap, but the possibility of uncovering critical evidence outweighed their fears. Arriving at the warehouse, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and unease. The building loomed, a hulking relic of a forgotten industrial past, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring into the dusk. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and the faint scent of oil and decay. Lars's flashlight beam swept across crates stacked haphazardly, graffiti scrawled on peeling walls, and shadows that seemed to shift with every step. As they ventured deeper, the sound of muffled voices reached them, a meeting in progress, or a trap waiting to be sprung. Suddenly, figures emerged from the darkness, rough-looking men armed and alert, their eyes narrowing as they spotted the police intrusion. The warehouse exploded into chaos once more, gunfire echoing through the cavernous space. Lars dove behind a crate, his heart pounding as bullets ricocheted nearby. The firefight was fierce but brief. With coordinated precision, Lars's team subdued the attackers, securing the area. Among the discarded crates, they found evidence far more damning than anyone expected. Stacks of forged documents, bags of unmarked cash, and encrypted drives holding detailed records of Delu's operations. But the most shocking discovery was a series of photographs, images of city officials shaking hands with known criminals, accompanied by cryptic notes hinting at ongoing bribery and blackmail. The implications were staggering. The criminal syndicate's reach was not limited to the streets or docks. It penetrated the corridors of power, influencing decisions at the highest levels. Lars felt a surge of anger and betrayal. The city he had sworn to protect was being sold piece by piece to the highest bidder. This was no longer just a criminal investigation. It was a battle against corruption itself, and the lines between friend and foe blurred with every revelation. Back at the station, Lars and Annika worked tirelessly to decrypt the data and cross-reference the information with their existing leads. Late into the night, the pieces began to fall into place, exposing a network that spanned beyond Amsterdam, reaching into neighboring countries and even international finance. Delu was orchestrating a multi-layered operation involving drug smuggling, human trafficking, and money laundering, all shielded by a web of silence and intimidation. The ledger was just the tip of the iceberg, and every step forward brought them closer to dangerous enemies willing to kill to protect their empire. The tension came to a head when Lars received a call from an unknown number. A distorted voice warned him to back off or face consequences. The threat was clear, but Lars's resolve hardened rather than wavered. He knew the risk he was taking, but this was the price of justice. As he hung up the phone, Annika looked at him with concern, the unspoken question lingering between them. How far were they willing to go to bring down a monster hiding in plain sight? The next day, a coordinated crackdown was planned, targeting key players and locations linked to Delu. Lars and Anika stood ready, the weight of the operation heavy on their shoulders. As the city bustled unaware, the streets would soon witness a showdown that could redefine Amsterdam's future. Lars's mind raced with possibilities, the victories they could claim, the losses they might suffer, and the fragile hope that justice could still prevail in a world shadowed by greed and betrayal. With the dawn breaking again over the canals, Lars took a deep breath and stepped into the light, ready to face whatever darkness awaited him in the heart of the city he loved. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. The chill of a misty autumn evening settled over Rotterdam, the city's towering cranes silhouetted against a slate-gray sky. Detective Eva Jansen stood alone on the cold pavement near the Maas River, her breath forming clouds in the damp air as she stared down at the lifeless body sprawled across the dock. The victim was a young man, barely in his 20s, dressed in a cheap jacket soaked by the drizzle, his face pale and unrecognizable beneath a deep bruise spreading across his temple. There was no identification, no wallet, nothing but a small scrap of paper clenched tightly in his fist. An address in the heart of the city, scrawled hastily in ink. Eva's gut twisted as she realized this was no ordinary mugging gone wrong. It was a carefully orchestrated message, and the hunt was just beginning. Rotterdam in 2020 was a city teetering between hope and chaos, its bustling port a crossroads of legal trade and shadowy undercurrents where criminal empires waged silent wars beneath the surface. Eva had seen the worst of it during her years on the force, but this murder felt different. It was a signpost pointing toward a deeper rot, a fracture in the fragile peace that kept the city from spiraling into anarchy. Her partner, Amir, arrived moments later, his expression grim but steady, the two exchanging a brief nod before turning their attention back to the scene. They were no strangers to violence, but the meticulous way this killing had been staged unnerved even the most hardened officers. The address on the note led them to a rundown apartment complex in the Rotterdam Noord district, a place where shadows lingered in every hallway and the hum of whispered deals filled the stale air. As Eva and Amir knocked on doors and questioned reluctant neighbors, a picture began to emerge of the victim's last days, an underworld runner caught between rival factions, desperate and alone. The story was pieced together in fragments, late-night meetings in dimly lit cafes, exchanges of briefcases thick with cash, and a dangerous secret that someone was willing to kill to protect. It was clear that the young man had stumbled into a war not meant for him, and now the city's criminal syndicates were closing ranks to erase all traces. Back at the station, Eva pored over reports and surveillance footage, searching for any clue to the identity of the victim or the motive behind the murder. The deeper she dug, the more she uncovered a tangled web of alliances and betrayals, with one name repeatedly surfacing: Johan van Dyck, a ruthless crime lord whose influence stretched from the docks to the elite clubs of the city. Van Dyck was a man feared not only for his brutal methods, but also for his ability to remain untouchable, shielded by layers of corruption and silence. Eva knew that to bring him down would require more than evidence. It would demand courage, cunning, and the willingness to confront the darkest corners of Rotterdam's underbelly. That night, as rain drummed against the windows of her modest apartment, Eva couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The line between hunter and hunted blurred as the city's shadows seemed to close in around her. The phone rang unexpectedly, and a voice on the other end whispered a chilling warning. "Walk away, or you'll end up like him." But Eva's resolve only hardened. She was no stranger to threats, and the streets of Rotterdam had taught her that justice often came at a steep price. With Amir's support, Eva planned a covert operation to infiltrate one of Van Dyck's warehouses rumored to be a hub for smuggling and illegal arms trade. The night was dense with fog as they approached the sprawling complex on the outskirts of the port, the faint glow of security lights barely penetrating the gloom. Every step was calculated, every breath measured as they slipped past guards and surveillance, driven by the hope that this raid would expose the machinery behind the city's rising violence. But beneath the surface, Eva sensed a trap, a deadly game where one misstep could mean the end. Inside the warehouse, crates stamped with foreign markings hinted at the international scope of Van Dyck's empire. The air was thick with the scent of oil and metal, punctuated by the low murmur of voices echoing through the cavernous space. Suddenly, the tension snapped as armed men burst from the shadows, guns drawn and voices shouting commands. A firefight erupted, the sharp crack of gunfire reverberating off steel and concrete as Eva and Amir took cover, their training guiding them through the chaos. Amidst the smoke and confusion, Eva's eyes caught movement near the loading docks, a figure slipping away with a briefcase, the key to unraveling the syndicate's operations. With adrenaline fueling her, Eva gave chase, sprinting across the slick floor and dodging obstacles in a desperate bid to catch the fugitive. The hunt spilled out onto the rain-soaked docks, the cold wind whipping at her face as the figure struggled to board a waiting boat. Time seemed to stretch as Eva lunged, grabbing the man's arm just before he could vanish into the night. The briefcase fell open, spilling documents and USB drives that glinted in the pale light. What they contained would be the key to exposing Van Dyke's network, or a dead end designed to lure them deeper into danger. As sirens wailed in the distance, Eva held the man tight, demanding answers that would not come easily. The game was far from over, and Rotterdam's streets promised more secrets, more lies, and more bloodshed before dawn. Eva's world had become a maze of shadows and peril, but she was determined to navigate it, no matter the cost. The following days were a relentless blur of interviews, evidence sorting, and late-night strategy sessions in the cramped precinct. Eva and Amir sat hunched over their desks, faces illuminated only by the glow of their computer screens, the hum of the city outside a distant reminder of the calm that never truly existed. The documents and USB drives seized from the docks revealed a sprawling network of illegal trades, drug shipments disguised as legitimate cargo, offshore accounts funneling untold sums of money, and covert communications linking Johan Van Dyke to influential businessmen and corrupt officials. The deeper they delved, the clearer it became that Van Dyke's grip on Rotterdam was suffocating, a shadow stretching into every facet of life, from the poorest neighborhoods to the gilded offices downtown. Eva's determination burned hotter with every new lead, but so did the danger closing in around her. Anonymous threats escalated into direct confrontations. Her car was vandalized with a message painted in bold red letters: "Stop digging or else." At home, the sense of being watched grew unbearable. Shadows flickered just beyond the edges of her vision, and strangers lingered too long at street corners. Amir advised caution, urging her to consider stepping back for her own safety, but Eva was resolute. The city needed justice, and she would be the one to deliver it, no matter the cost. Amid the mounting pressure, an unexpected ally emerged in the form of Lena, a sharp-witted investigative journalist who had been tracking Van Dyke's empire for years. Their initial meeting was terse. Trust was scarce in a world riddled with betrayal, but they soon found common ground. Lena's sources and Eva's official access complemented each other, creating a powerful force against the syndicate. Together, they uncovered a critical piece of the puzzle: a clandestine auction scheduled to take place in an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of Rotterdam, where high-value stolen goods and illicit contracts were exchanged under the veil of secrecy. It was the kind of event that only the most powerful dared attend, and crashing it could provide the evidence needed to topple Van Dyke once and for all. The night of the auction arrived with a biting wind that swept through the bare trees lining the country road. Eva and Amir arrived disguised as wealthy buyers, their nerves taut beneath expensive suits that felt foreign and uncomfortable. The mansion loomed, its broken windows like eyes watching their every move, but inside, a decadent party was underway, the air thick with cigarette smoke, whispered deals, and the clink of fine crystal glasses. Faces masked by ornate Venetian masks mingled with a mixture of arrogance and paranoia, the kind of gathering where power was flaunted and fear simmered just beneath the surface. Eva's heart pounded as they navigated the crowd, cameras concealed in their sleeves capturing every detail. Among the guests, familiar figures from their investigations mingled casually: politicians, crime bosses, and shadowy financiers who smiled too easily and watched too closely. The auctioneer, a slick man with a silver tongue, began the proceedings, revealing rare art pieces, forged documents, and even weapons of mass destruction, each item bidding higher than the last in a disturbing display of wealth and influence. Eva's eyes scanned the crowd, catching snippets of conversation that hinted at upcoming deals far more sinister than anything on the auction block. Suddenly, Lena's voice crackled through their earpieces, a tip-off that Van Dyke himself had arrived, stepping through the grand doors with an entourage that drew a hush over the room. Eva's pulse quickened. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Van Dyke was known for his ruthless charisma, and as he took the stage, the crowd fell into a tense silence. His eyes scanned the room with a predator's precision, and when they met Eva's for a fleeting moment, she saw something dangerous flicker beneath his polished exterior. a silent warning that he was always one step ahead. The auction reached its climax with the presentation of a mysterious black briefcase, rumored to contain evidence capable of bringing down governments. Bids soared, and Eva knew this was their chance. She signaled Amir, and together they made their move, attempting to intercept the briefcase before it fell into the wrong hands. But as they closed in, alarms blared suddenly. A trap had been sprung. Security closed ranks, and the lavish hall transformed into a battleground. Gunfire erupted, chandeliers shattered, and guests scattered in panic. Eva fought through the chaos, dodging bullets and debris as she pushed toward the briefcase, her mind racing to stay one step ahead. Amir covered her, their movements honed by years of partnership, but the odds were overwhelming. Amid the confusion, the briefcase was snatched by a figure draped in black, disappearing through a hidden exit just as the police backup stormed the mansion. Eva cursed the missed opportunity, but refused to give up. They had witnessed enough to implicate Van Dyke's circle, and now the real pursuit began. Back at headquarters, the aftermath was grim. Several officers were injured, and the media swirled with rumors of a violent showdown among Rotterdam's elite. Eva's resolve hardened as she stared at the fragments of evidence they'd managed to secure. The battle was far from over. Van Dyke was still out there, his empire sprawling like a shadow over the city, but she was determined to shine a light into every corner. Justice was no longer just an ideal. It was a fight that would consume her life until the truth was laid bare. As dawn broke over Rotterdam, Eva stood by the river once more, the water reflecting the awakening city. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. In a world where crime and power were inseparable, the only way to win was to become the relentless force no one could escape. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. The Canal Pact. Amsterdam, Netherlands, 2018. Amsterdam, in the autumn of 2018, had begun to lose its touristy charm under a new, subtler form of decay. The clatter of bicycle chains still echoed across its cobbled lanes, and the canal boats still carried laughing groups of foreigners beneath arched stone bridges. But behind the postcard image, deeper in the city's belly, another rhythm beat. A colder, darker one that pulsed beneath the floorboards of historic warehouses turned into nightclubs, and inside the dim, smoky basements of coffee shops that operated beyond their licenses. It was here, among the city's elegant facades and water-laced streets, that Vincent Droz, a former customs officer turned freelance fixer, found himself entangled in the sort of game that no one ever really walked away from clean. He was neither a hero nor a villain, just another man who had drifted too close to the wrong people for too long. It started, as these things often do, with something small. Vincent had been hired to look the other way, at a routine port inspection near IJmuiden. The job was simple: ignore a specific container number during a scheduled sweep of incoming vessels. The payment was generous, 15,000 euros wired to a freshly minted offshore account, and a promise of more. It was the kind of temptation that knew exactly which tired, gray part of a man's soul to stroke. Vincent accepted, but the container didn't carry weapons or drugs or even stolen electronics. Instead, it held 4 people, disoriented, dehydrated, and terrified, each with false passports and bruises on their backs from weeks of confinement. Human trafficking. That was when Vincent realized he'd made a deal with something far bigger than a local smuggling ring. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about survival. The men behind the operation called themselves the Rod, the Council. They weren't a gang in the traditional sense. No graffiti tags or flashy turf wars. They were something else. Organized, meticulous, European in the worst way, anonymous, multilingual, and absolutely without scruples. They operated across Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands, trafficking not just people, but identities, medical documents, academic diplomas, and financial records. They had men in ministries and friends in digital places no ordinary police officer could trace. Vincent had stumbled into their logistics arm, and by the time he realized how deeply embedded they were, it was too late to extract himself. By November, Vincent had already started drinking again. The whiskey helped blur the lines between who he was and who he was becoming. His Amsterdam flat, once clean and methodically organized, now stank of old clothes, fast food, and something fouler that even he couldn't place. But he knew better than to disappear. Disappearing raised alarms. And so he showed up for work, smiled at the right people, and took on the council's assignments with mechanical precision. Until the day he found the note. It was tucked under his windscreen wiper, typed in clean Dutch, and signed, "We know you helped them in IJmuiden. Meet me at Oud Kirk." Midnight. At first, he considered ignoring it, a trap, maybe, or worse, a joke. But curiosity clawed at him all day. He skipped dinner, loaded a compact pistol into his coat pocket, and walked to the red-lit district near the Kirk Cathedral under cover of darkness. Prostitutes stood in windows like mannequins under crimson light, and laughter from the nearby bars bounced off the canal walls. But Vincent kept to the shadows, approaching the centuries-old church with cautious steps. At midnight, the bells tolled above him, and he waited. Out of the dark emerged a woman, short, mid-30s, with tightly pulled-back auburn hair and a faint scar across her eyebrow. She moved like someone who'd grown up on rough streets and now knew how to avoid being noticed. Her name was Mira, and she was from Europol's human trafficking task force. She told Vincent that she'd been watching him for months, that she knew about his history, his weaknesses, and his latest sins. And then she gave him a choice: help her take down Dorad from the inside, or spend the rest of his life rotting in a prison cell in The Hague. She had the files. She had the photos. She had everything. Vincent didn't answer that night. He just walked away, heart hammering, the city suddenly more suffocating than ever. But in the following days, as he watched yet another shipment of silhouettes, as the traffickers called them, pass through under false customs tags, he made his decision. He called the burner number she'd left and agreed to meet again. That's when the operation began, a slow, deliberate unraveling of one of Europe's most clandestine criminal networks from the inside. His cover remained intact, though the weight of what he was doing grew heavier with each passing week. Mira fed him instructions through dead drops and encrypted USBs. Plant listening devices in specific meeting rooms, copy certain documents, delay certain shipments by a day to let her team intercept without arousing suspicion. Vincent felt like a pawn being moved across a board he didn't understand, but he trusted her more than he feared Dorad, which was saying something, considering what he knew of their methods. They didn't just kill people. They erased them, made them ghosts. No bodies, no headlines, just disappearance and silence. Then came the job that nearly broke it all. Dorad wanted him to accompany a truck shipment to a supposed storage unit in Utrecht. But Myra's files had already flagged the address. It was one of their transfer points, a holding location for kidnapped individuals meant to be moved into new countries with forged identities. Mira begged him not to go. She said her team was not ready for a full raid, not yet. But Dorad had eyes everywhere. If Vincent refused, they'd know. So he agreed to go, strapping a tiny audio transmitter beneath his belt and boarding the unmarked van at dawn. The drive was long and tense, through endless highways and gray skies. The other men in the van, silent, Eastern European, eyes like knives, didn't speak to him. When they arrived, the warehouse looked abandoned, weeds growing through cracks in the asphalt. But inside was a different world. Chain-link cages, bunk beds, LED lights buzzing overhead. 23 people were there, all undocumented, all terrified, and Vincent's job, supposedly, was to help sort them for travel. But before anything could begin, Myra's voice cracked into his earpiece. Abort. They're onto us. And in that moment, surrounded by criminals and captives, Vincent had to decide whether to die a traitor or vanish like all the others. Vincent didn't have time to think, not properly. The buzz in his earpiece faded into white noise as one of the guards barked something in Ukrainian and started walking toward him, his hand casually resting near the inside of his coat, where a pistol likely waited. Vincent turned, slow and deliberate, keeping his expression blank, and moved toward one of the cages where a woman clutched a child to her chest. It wasn't just the fear in her eyes that unnerved him. It was the resignation. She had been through this before. She knew that begging didn't work. He reached for his keys, feigning a lock check, just as Myra's voice cut back into his ear with terrifying clarity. Van headed your way. 15 minutes. Get out of the building before extraction. But there was no easy way out. The back exit had already been chained shut by one of the others, and the front was still manned. He would have to create a diversion, or die trying. That's when he noticed it, an old fuse box along the far wall. Rusted, barely held together. It had probably been part of the building when it was still a textile warehouse decades ago. He made his way toward it, clutching the radio transmitter Mira had given him. It had a shortwave frequency trigger. One push, and it would emit a static burst meant to be picked up by nearby agents. It would also overload its own circuitry. Vincent pushed the button. The result was more dramatic than anticipated. Sparks burst from the box, and smoke rose quickly. The lights flickered, then died. Shouts erupted as the warehouse fell into semi-darkness. One of the traffickers cursed in Dutch. Another pulled a flashlight and began moving through the cages. Vincent ran. Not toward the door, but deeper, past a row of stacked mattresses and metal crates. He ducked behind a support beam and ripped open a fire escape window. Cold air hit him like a slap. Below, a narrow alley choked with garbage, but empty. He jumped. He hit the ground hard, rolling through broken bottles and ash. His coat snagged on a wire, but he tore it free. Behind him, gunshots rang out, not aimed at him, yet, but clearly part of the chaos. Myra's team had arrived. A black unmarked van screeched to a halt just a block away, doors flying open as two tactical agents emerged in plain clothes and body armor. They shouted in Dutch, ordering him to freeze, but he was already raising his hands. They pulled him inside, and the van peeled away just as more shots echoed through the warehouse district. Hours later, inside an off-grid safe house in Leiden, Vincent sat at a metal table with a coffee that had long gone cold and a cigarette burning between his fingers. Mira paced in front of him. The raid had been partially successful. 11 people were recovered. The others had vanished, relocated, or hidden by a secondary team before they could arrive. One of the council's mid-tier coordinators had been shot, another arrested. But the operation had been compromised. Someone had leaked the location. They suspected a mole, possibly inside Dutch customs, or even Europol itself. Mira didn't say much after that, just handed him a flash drive and told him to memorize the files and destroy it. The drive contained blueprints, the full structure of de Rod's Dutch network. Safe houses, bank accounts, passport printers, encrypted contact chains. Vincent barely slept that night, his brain overloaded with the scope of it. De Rod was like a hydra. Even if one head was cut off, 5 more grew back. They had people in NGOs, people in law firms, people who could falsify birth certificates in 10 languages. If they were going to bring it all down, it had to be surgical, strategic, and quiet. Vincent was moved again. Rotterdam this time. A hotel near the harbor, always under alias. Weeks passed, then months. He made deliveries, fed intel, arranged fake mishaps to stall cargo. A cog within a machine he hated, but had become skilled at navigating. Each new assignment brought him closer to the inner circle. And eventually it happened. He was invited to meet Conrad, the invisible architect of the Dutch arm of de Rod, a man known only by voice until now. The meeting was to take place at a private residence outside Utrecht, a manor on the edge of a lake, its driveway lined with linden trees and watched over by 2 silent guards with military posture and no insignias. Vincent dressed the part, clean blazer, dull gray slacks, nothing flashy. He wore a micro-recorder sewn into his cuff. Mira had begged him not to go in alone, but they both knew this was their best, maybe only, chance to dismantle the network in one stroke. Inside, the manor was immaculately preserved. Polished floors, oil paintings, bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Conrad turned out to be unexpectedly soft-spoken. A man in his 60s, hair silver, glasses resting low on a hawk-like nose. The kind of man who might have taught university ethics decades earlier before finding that crime paid better than tenure. They spoke in Dutch. Conrad asked polite questions. How Vincent felt about the job, what he thought of the recent raids, whether he believed loyalty could still be bought in an age where everything seemed traceable. Vincent answered carefully, but with enough conviction to pass. Conrad nodded, pleased. Then he said something Vincent didn't expect. There is a leak in the council. From within. I believe we've been infiltrated. Vincent's blood ran cold. He nodded, pretending curiosity. Do you have suspects? Conrad smiled, small, calculated. A few, but I think we'll let them lead us to their friends. In the end, betrayal always exposes itself. When Vincent left that night, he knew the countdown had begun. Mira had 72 hours to act. 3 days to pull every string, trigger every arrest, seize every location before the council went dark. And she did. On a rain-soaked March morning, simultaneous raids hit properties in The Hague, Utrecht, Groningen, and Maastricht. Over 50 arrests. Over 100 identities liberated. And somewhere in the chaos, Conrad disappeared. Not captured, not confirmed dead. Just vanished. Vincent was exfiltrated weeks later, his name erased from Dutch databases, a new life waiting for him in Canada. But he never forgot the faces of the trafficked, the traffickers, or the woman in the cage with the child in her arms. Mira sent him postcards sometimes, never signed, never explicit. Just images of canals, windmills, or fields of tulips. Each one a reminder of the war beneath the surface. The war they almost lost. Because in Amsterdam, behind the flowers and the boats, the real city had no postcards. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. Shadows over Scheveningen. The wind swept in off the North Sea with a kind of bitterness that made even hardened locals flinch. And as twilight crawled over Scheveningen, the once cheerful beach town on the outskirts of The Hague darkened with something older than weather. In the narrow, salt-stained alleys behind the boulevard, past the tourist shops shuttered for the season, a man named Lucien Kroll stood beneath a flickering lamppost, collar upturned, fingers clenched around a small envelope of paper that could shift the balance of crime in half the country. He was sweating despite the cold. His breath came fast and shallow. He kept looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone, or something, to materialize from the dense Dutch fog curling off the canal. Lucien was a courier, but not the kind that delivered packages with barcodes. He delivered silence, loyalty, secrets, the currency of the underground, and tonight, he carried the names of 5 men and 1 woman, each of whom had helped move stolen Czech firearms through the Rotterdam port and into the hands of men in Brussels and Antwerp who would make them disappear again. He had been told to hand the envelope to a man in a blue coat with red stitching at precisely 2015, on the stone steps behind the Grand Hotel Amherst Kurhaus. But it was now 2019, and no one had shown. Lucien checked his burner phone. No signal. That was expected. His employers, known only as the Zestkamer or Sixth Chamber, a satirical nod to the Dutch Parliament's shadowy unwritten rules, rarely allowed their pawns to walk into a meeting with working tech. That also meant if something went wrong, he was alone. The Sixth Chamber had existed since the mid-90s, born from the ashes of the post-Cold War chaos, nurtured through Balkan arms trafficking, and matured into a ghost-like force that whispered into Dutch politics and barked orders in the port unions. They ran guns, data, and sometimes people, with a precision that made them more feared than loved, even by their own. And Lucien? He was tired. He had spent a decade on the bottom rung, watching younger, crueler men ascend, and he had recently begun whispering to someone else. Someone official. It had started in Utrecht months earlier, when a man calling himself Peter had cornered Lucien outside a coffee shop. No badge. No gun. Just a photograph of a 12-year-old boy who had been caught in the crossfire of a shipment that had gone wrong in Charleroi, one of Lucien's shipments. Peter had said nothing more than, "You helped kill him." Then he handed Lucien a card with a number and left. Guilt had a flavor, Lucien now knew, and it sat thick and metallic in the back of his throat whenever he thought about the photograph. Eventually he had called. Eventually he had talked. And tonight, the envelope was a trap. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Give the courier real information, follow him, trace the Sixth Chamber's handler, and take them alive. Peter's unit, some splinter of the Dutch National Crime Squad, too unofficial to have a name, had eyes all over the promenade, dressed like drunks and lovers and waiters. Lucien had been promised immunity, a new identity, and a way out. All he had to do was hand over the envelope. But the man never came. Instead, at 2023, 2 men arrived from opposite directions. One wore a black coat, the other gray, both with umbrellas. They didn't match the description. They didn't even speak. But they moved like wolves. Lucien took a step back, almost slipped on the wet stone. Behind him, the roar of the sea masked his rising panic. The man in black walked straight toward him, and then, in an action so sudden it broke the spell of hesitation, grabbed his wrist. Lucien dropped the envelope. It fluttered between them. That was the cue. Peter's voice, urgent, cracked across a hidden radio frequency. A half-dozen plainclothes agents moved. But something had gone wrong. There was a scream. A gunshot. The man in gray was faster than expected, a blade in his coat sleeve, which he threw at an approaching officer with a precision that suggested military training. Chaos erupted on the steps of the Kurhaus. Lucien bolted. He didn't wait to see who had fallen. He didn't think, just ran. Into the alleys, into the fish market backroads where seagulls screamed over discarded bones. His lungs burned, heart a drum. He clutched the burner phone, still dead. Rain had started falling again, the kind that came sideways and soaked through shoes. He ducked beneath an archway, panting, shaking. Someone had tipped off the Sixth Chamber. His betrayal was no longer secret. Half an hour later, across town in a drab office inside a converted warehouse, Peter slammed his fist against a steel desk. The surveillance team had been compromised. One officer injured, another missing. The envelope had been recovered, but tampered with. Half the names were gone. Peter paced, furious. He had trusted Lucien, and now the whole operation was on the verge of collapse. But Lucien hadn't been caught. That meant something. It meant he was either dead or still running. And run he did. Lucien made his way to Delft, stealing a bicycle from outside a youth hostel, and pedaling like a madman down the back routes until the pain in his legs matched the burn of fear in his chest. He couldn't go home, couldn't contact anyone. By morning, he was in a cheap room above a florist's shop, nursing a cut on his temple and trying to decide whether to disappear or finish what he started. Because tucked inside his coat, unnoticed even in the chaos, was a second envelope. Not with names, but locations, locker numbers, keys, USB drives. If Peter got that, maybe it wasn't all for nothing. Maybe the sixth chamber could still be exposed. But he had to live long enough to deliver it, and the wolves were already hunting. By the time the morning fog had lifted from Delft's gabled rooftops and the cafes began putting out their chairs for the early commuters, Lucien had already changed his appearance twice. A beanie replaced his familiar cap. He'd shaved his patchy beard with a dull disposable razor from the hostel's bathroom, and he wore a second-hand raincoat he'd lifted from a laundromat dryer. There was no glamour in running, only discomfort, paranoia, and the slow erosion of self. He looked at his reflection in the florist's cracked mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. The cut on his temple had clotted, but the ache behind his eyes remained. Beneath his jacket, the second envelope was pressed flat against his chest, still intact. It felt heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried, not in mass, but in consequence. It contained GPS coordinates for containers at the port of Rotterdam, burner phone logs of conversations in Arabic and Serbo-Croatian, and account numbers tied to trusts in Curaçao and Cyprus. And worse, or better, depending on which side you stood, it contained surveillance photos, names with faces. A few of those faces belonged to sitting members of parliament. One, infamously, had once chaired a justice subcommittee. This was not just evidence. It was dynamite, and Lucien was sitting on the fuse. He knew the sixth chamber wouldn't make the same mistake twice. They had hunters, people who worked in the shadows, with no names, no traces, only results. If they were already in Delft, it was only a matter of time before someone knocked at the wrong door or followed the wrong scent and found him. He couldn't stay still, but he also couldn't keep running blindly. He needed Peter, needed a handoff. The problem was Peter wouldn't trust him now, not after the chaos at Scheveningen. They would assume Lucien had either flipped again or gone rogue. Trust was fragile, and in Peter's world, it evaporated with gunfire. Still, Lucien had an idea. If Peter's team was smart, and they would still be monitoring CCTV traffic across key transit nodes. Lucien needed to make himself visible, not too obvious, but enough to trigger recognition. He needed to send a message without words. At precisely 9:45, Lucien walked directly in front of a tram camera at the Delft Central Station, holding a newspaper upside down. A simple signal. A code Peter had mentioned in their earliest meetings, a nod to Cold War spycraft. If the team was watching, they'd see it. If the sixth chamber was watching too, well, that was the gamble. Then Lucien left the tram station, crossed the street, and ducked into the old library, a monolithic gray structure that reeked of mildew and underfunding. He slipped behind the stacks and sat with his back against the travel section, watching the front entrance through the reflections on a pane of dirty glass. And he waited. 27 minutes later, a woman entered. Tall, dark leather gloves, a strand of blonde hair escaping from beneath a green beret. She didn't look at him directly, didn't pause, didn't acknowledge. But she walked to the information desk, asked for a book that didn't exist, then sat in the aisle directly adjacent to his. A soft cough, a tap of a fingernail against the wooden shelf. It was the signal. Lucien rose slowly, walked to the edge, and turned. She stood across from him. "Peter sent you," he whispered. She nodded. "You still have it?" Lucien patted his chest. "Untouched. But if they're tracking me, this whole place could be compromised." "They're not. We're watching them too. You're lucky, Kroll. They're furious. Your face is on every screen from here to Brussels." "Not my first manhunt," Lucien said dryly. She smirked, then extended a folded piece of paper from her book. "Coordinates. You have 90 minutes. Deliver it here. Then disappear. And Peter?" She hesitated. "Alive, but he's under internal review. Your move in Scheveningen nearly cost him his command." Lucien's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then I better make it count." The drop point was an abandoned bus depot near the outskirts of The Hague, overgrown with weeds and hemmed in by half-collapsed fencing. Lucien arrived with time to spare, taking side streets and ducking traffic cameras. He left the envelope beneath the driver's seat of an old connection bus marked for demolition, then walked away without looking back. He didn't know if the woman, or someone else, would retrieve it. He didn't know if it would be enough. But it was done, and in that moment, a weight lifted from his chest, only to be replaced by a colder, deeper sense of foreboding. Because as he passed a boarded-up snack bar across the street, he noticed the same black van that had been parked outside his florist hideout. Same dent in the fender. Same parking angle. Too much of a coincidence. He didn't run. Not yet. But his blood froze. They were here. Lucien turned into an alley. Then another. Tried to double back. But the city closed in on him like a maze of wet brick and echoing footsteps. Behind him, voices, calm male and in Dutch. Lucien. Geen paniek. That was the problem. He had every reason to panic. Two figures emerged, one with a silenced weapon, the other with zip ties already in hand. No uniforms. No official words of arrest. Just men doing a job that ended with bodies in canals. But as they stepped forward, a crack rang out, sharp, fast, and final. One man dropped. The other screamed and spun, blood spurting from a shattered thigh. From the rooftop above, a third shot barked. Silence. A voice echoed from above. Move now, Kroll. Lucien ran, not questioning the miracle. A van screeched into the mouth of the alley. Doors flung open. The woman with the green beret leaned out. Get in. He dove inside. Tires burned rubber. The van peeled away, weaving through morning traffic like a shark through minnows. Inside, the woman checked his pulse. You just became the most wanted man in the Netherlands, she said. Lucien didn't answer. He just closed his eyes and leaned back. Somewhere in Rotterdam, the pieces were already shifting. But the game, the war behind the curtain, had only just begun. Certainly. Here is page 3, ending, of the fictional crime narrative Shadows over Scheveningen, set in the Netherlands, 2016, continuing from page 2. This page contains approximately 1,000 words and wraps up the story with long paragraphs, as requested. The van swerved off the main road and into the industrial spine of Rotterdam, the old harbor stacks looming like iron skeletons against a pale Dutch sky. Even under heavy cloud cover, the weight of history seemed to press down on the docklands. A mix of faded shipping containers, graffiti-blistered warehouses, and silence so thick it made the air taste metallic. The woman didn't speak again until they reached the blind end of a cul-de-sac lined with rusted-out forklifts and black water seeping from clogged gutters. She turned off the engine and twisted in her seat. You'll stay here until nightfall. Then we cross. Cross what? Lucien asked, wiping sweat from his brow with his coat sleeve. His pulse was still erratic, his nerves raw from the ambush. The border. We're taking you out through Belgium. Peter wants you in Brussels, then to Lyon. After that, you vanish. Again. Lucien stared at the floor of the van, then slowly raised his eyes. What about the files? The 6th chamber? They'll burn it, she said bitterly. What's left of it? Your data package cracked the door, but we won't be allowed to prosecute. Not officially. Too many names, too much money. We've already received pressure from the Binnenhof to deprioritize that. He scoffed. So all this, the bodies, the chase, it's for nothing? No, she said, softer now. It's not for nothing. Some of those people are panicking. They're already moving money, cutting ties, disappearing. That means fractures. And fractures give us entry points. You made the machine shudder, Lucien. And now we watch where the pieces fall. Lucien leaned back, head thudding against the van wall. He could smell oil and dust and the faint trace of blood on his collar. He wasn't sure if it was his own. It didn't matter. He'd delivered the evidence. He'd survived the hunters. And yet, there was no elation. No victory. Only more hiding. More running. And more shadows. He dozed off for an hour, maybe more. When he woke, the sky was violet, streaked with red. The woman was gone. In her place sat a small duffel bag and a burner phone. A note scribbled on hotel stationery lay folded on top. Follow the GPS. You'll be met outside Antwerp. Leave the van. Burn it if you can. P. No signature. No guarantee. Just Peter's initial, the last vestige of the life Lucien once had, if it could even be called a life. He opened the bag. A passport in the name of Arnaud Delenc, Belgian national, born in Charleroi. The photo was recent. Too recent. Somehow they always had resources, these people behind the resistance. Money, documents, weapons. Everything except stability. He dressed in the new clothes, jeans, sweater, heavy boots, and slid the passport into his pocket. Then he torched the van. It went up faster than he expected. The plastic interior curled and blackened, glass cracking, tires squealing in the heat. The smell was acrid, the kind that stuck in the throat and lungs. But no alarms rang. No police came. Rotterdam's harbor district had its own rules, and everyone knew when to look the other way. Lucien walked south for nearly 4 kilometers before he found the highway. Hitched a ride with a Polish trucker hauling tiles. They didn't speak, just nodded at each other. The silence was comfortable, the kind of silence born from shared exile. They crossed the border before midnight. No roadblocks, no customs, just a blur of lights and a fading sense of jurisdiction. In Belgium, Lucien was no longer a manhunt subject. He was just another ghost drifting between bureaucracies. The rendezvous point was an abandoned rest stop 10 minutes outside Antwerp, a bench under a dead street lamp, an old vending machine humming with electricity, but long since emptied of candy. He sat on the bench, staring into the woods beyond the lot, wondering if he'd just walk into them and never come out again. But at 016 a car arrived. Black, tinted windows, Dutch plates or clever forgeries. The rear window rolled down. "You're late," said a familiar voice. Lucien smiled bitterly. "You're alive." Peter stepped out, older than Lucien remembered, lines etched deeper, beard grayer, but eyes the same, sharp, calculating, heavy with knowledge. "You've put me in an impossible position," Peter said without warmth. "I gave you the files, and in doing so you triggered an interagency turf war, pissed off 3 intelligence services, and nearly got my wife followed in The Hague. You think this ends clean?" "No," Lucien said, "but it ends with a crack in the wall. That's all we ever had." Peter stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "We're sending you to a safe house in Lyon. Then someone will take you further south. After that, I don't want to know." Lucien nodded. "Understood." They didn't shake hands. No farewells. Peter simply turned and got back into the car. The driver hit the gas. Within moments, the taillights had vanished. Lucien waited alone for a beat longer. Then a second car pulled up, a gray Peugeot. A woman inside rolled down the window. This one he didn't recognize. "Arnaud Delanque?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Get in." He did. They drove in silence toward France. The road was wet. The night long. The future unwritten. Somewhere behind him, powerful men were scrubbing their hard drives and rewriting history. Somewhere ahead, someone else would pick up the thread. The shadows would remain, in Scheveningen, in Rotterdam, in Delft. But for tonight, Lucien was alive. And sometimes, in this kind of war, survival itself was the final act of defiance. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. The Delft Conspiracy. Delft, Netherlands, 2014. The canals of Delft held secrets. Beneath their postcard charm, the calm water mirroring rows of gabled roofs, the gentle rhythm of cyclists on cobbled lanes, lingered a history of silence, and in 2014, that silence was ready to break. It started in late autumn, when the air carried a crisp finality and the orange of the leaves smeared against the slate-gray sky like old paint. Inspector Rijke van Loon stood at the edge of Oud Delft Canal, staring down at the body of Professor Frederick Bol, a renowned historian and archivist, now floating face up in the water like a ruined manuscript. His eyes, wide with horror, seemed to accuse the world as his stiffened hands clawed upward in protest. Bol had been missing for 3 days. When he finally surfaced, it wasn't from voluntary reappearance. Someone had ensured he would never speak again. The murder wouldn't have caused national attention, had it not been for what Bol had been working on. According to his colleagues at the Delft University of Technology, the professor had recently uncovered documents that threatened to upend long-held assumptions about a Cold War-era intelligence agreement between the Dutch government and NATO. Bol had been digitizing a forgotten trove of declassified material from the 1970s when he stumbled upon encrypted messages between Dutch security services and a clandestine NATO program referred to only as Orange Ziegel, the Orange Seal. The documents hinted at unauthorized surveillance of Dutch citizens, foreign dissidents, and perhaps most damning of all, secret experiments in behavioral control conducted under the guise of sociological research. It was conspiracy theory fodder, until Bol turned up dead. Rijke, a man of quiet pragmatism and thinning patience, knew better than to trust coincidence. In his 15 years as a police inspector, he'd learned the worst crimes often dressed themselves in routine. The file he opened on Bohl's death was labeled as a probable suicide within 24 hours. Ridge knew the phrasing was no accident. When death knocks on the doors of people like Professor Bohl, suicide becomes the state's preferred mask. Yet it didn't sit right. The marks on the professor's wrists weren't consistent with self-harm. They bore the crisp indentation of plastic restraints. More suspicious still was the erased footage from the university's main security server. Entire blocks of surveillance from the archives wing had been corrupted, and not a single backup could be recovered. Ridge took his suspicions to his supervisor at the Haglanden police unit, only to be met with an uncomfortable shrug and a redirect toward less controversial cases. "We don't investigate ghosts, Ridge," the captain had said. "Let Bohl rest. Let the past rest with him." But ghosts had a habit of haunting those who ignored them. 2 days later, Ridge received an anonymous flash drive in his home mailbox. No postage, no fingerprint. The files it contained were scrambled fragments, snippets of government correspondence, maps with Dutch military installations circled in red, and a single still image. A young woman, face half lit, standing in a room filled with old books and what appeared to be surveillance monitors. On the back of the photo was written, "Find her before they do." That same evening, Ridge drove through the mist-laced roads of the city, each street lamp casting spectral shadows onto the canal walls. He didn't tell anyone at the station. He knew how rumors spread, how a whisper could become suspicion, and how suspicion, when pointed at an honest man, was more fatal than guilt. He followed the faint breadcrumb trail embedded in the files. An address registered to a private archive near the Prinsenhof Museum, closed to the public for decades, officially listed as non-operational. Ridge parked under a tree heavy with frost and approached on foot, the building standing silent and gray against the night. Inside, it smelled of dust and forgotten secrets. The walls were lined with microfilm drawers and iron vault doors. He called out once, no answer. But someone had been there. A mug of tea, still warm, sat on a desk beneath a pile of papers. Then, from the upper landing, he heard footsteps. Ridge drew his weapon but kept it low, his instincts honed from years dealing with jumpy dealers and angry drunks. But the figure who emerged was no criminal. It was the woman from the photograph. She looked younger than in the image, but her eyes were unmistakable. Cold, intelligent, watching. "You shouldn't have come," she said, accent crisp, her Dutch laced with the faintest trace of French. "I'm Inspector Van Loon," Ridge replied. "I believe you're in danger." She gave a dry laugh. "We're all in danger. You just figured it out later than most." He asked her name. She said it was Elodie Van Acker, though the way she said it made Ridge think she had used many names in her life. She claimed to be a data analyst once contracted by the Ministry of Defense, but who had been blacklisted after attempting to leak documents related to Orange Ziegel in 2011. According to her, Bohl had found what she couldn't: the names of those still alive, still operating, high-ranking officials, diplomats, industrialists. Men who had buried the past under layers of bureaucracy and fear. "You think this is just a murder?" she asked, pulling a folder from the bottom of a locked cabinet. "It's a purge. There are others who know. I've been trying to protect them, but it's getting harder." Ridge opened the folder. Inside were dossiers on 4 individuals: a retired intelligence officer in Leiden, a sociologist in Utrecht, a journalist in Haarlem, and a former NATO liaison now living under a false name in Brussels. All had been publicly silent for years. All, according to Elodie, were next. Before Ridge could speak, the front windows exploded inward. The glass tore through the air in a deadly cascade, glinting like falling stars before it embedded itself in the wooden floor and scattered across the ancient files with a hissing whisper. Ridge threw himself behind the nearest bookshelf, his police instincts overriding his stunned disbelief. Elodie had already moved, fast, precise, like someone who had trained for such moments. She dragged a hidden latch from beneath the desk, revealing a trapdoor that had blended into the dark grain of the floorboards. "This way!" she snapped, her voice hard but steady, as another round of gunfire cracked through the silence, echoing like war drums off the walls of the archive. Ridge scrambled after her, holstering his weapon as they dropped into the gloom below. They landed in a narrow tunnel carved beneath the building, likely a remnant from the war, or perhaps older. Delft's underground was riddled with forgotten passageways and collapsed corridors from centuries of change. The tunnel was damp, the smell of rot and time thick in the air. Elodie didn't speak as they moved, only motioned for silence, her flashlight bouncing shadows off the brickwork. Ridge followed, adrenaline pulsing hot in his blood, the weight of his badge feeling suddenly irrelevant. He had spent his career chasing thieves and liars. This was different. This was a war fought in the dark, with names erased from history before they could be written. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, they emerged in a locked boiler room beneath a cafe 2 streets over. The kitchen above was quiet, but Elodie used a keypad hidden beneath the stairs to unlock a side door. Once in the alley, she didn't pause. They weaved through the back streets of Delft like ghosts, avoiding cameras, staying close to the canal edges and service roads. Ridge wanted to ask questions: who had attacked them, how she had prepared such a flawless escape, what she knew that had gotten people killed, but there was no time. When they finally stopped, it was inside a shuttered photography studio near the market, its front window covered with yellowed newspapers and fake for sale signs. Only when the final bolt slid home did Elodie turn to face him. "They found us too quickly," she said, "which means someone's monitoring police networks. Probably more than that." She moved to an old cabinet and retrieved 2 phones, one of them already ringing. She answered in French, listened, nodded, then hung up. The officer in Leiden is dead. They burned his apartment. He never made it out. Ridge felt the walls close in. His head throbbed from the pressure of knowledge he never asked to carry. This isn't a rogue operation. This is coordinated, funded, protected. He said it more to himself than her, but she nodded. They've been doing this since the early 80s. The original Orange Ziegel program was designed as a domestic resilience project. Propaganda, population mood analysis, counter-subversion, that sort of thing. But it evolved. When the Cold War ended, they pivoted. Behavioral data replaced wiretaps. Psychology replaced brute surveillance. It became about control, through media, social trends, even academic institutions. Anyone who questioned it, anyone with evidence, disappeared. Elodie sat across from him, pulling a faded envelope from her bag. Inside were handwritten notes in Bohl's hand, maps of underground facilities in The Hague, and coded names tied to energy firms, defense contractors, and members of parliament. Bohl cracked the names. That's why they killed him. The old files were the key, cross-referencing personnel transfers, financial records, old NATO rosters. There are at least 3 high-ranking figures in government now who were involved in the early stages. Ridge scanned the documents, his mind spinning. The implications were catastrophic. If even part of it was true, the Dutch government had been manipulated for decades by a cabal of intelligence veterans operating in the shadows, laundering their influence through layers of bureaucracy and partnerships. It would explain the erratic policy swings, the suppression of certain academic research, the black budget allocations that no one ever accounted for. And now people like Bohl, and perhaps himself, were targets. "We can't go to the police," Elodie said. "They've got plants everywhere. Intelligence, judiciary, media. But I have an asset in Brussels, former journalist, now working with an NGO that tracks political corruption. We can get this to him. If he publishes internationally, it's harder to suppress." Ridge leaned back, his thoughts churning. He had always believed in the slow integrity of law, that truth, no matter how buried, could be exhumed by process and reason. But now, faced with something so systemic and vile, the law felt inadequate. "We'll need proof. Not just testimony. Something they can't erase or discredit." Elodie smiled faintly. "That's why we need to go to Rotterdam." "Why Rotterdam?" "Because that's where the backups are. Bohl told me before he died he made copies. Not on servers. On physical tapes. Stored in a secure site beneath the Erasmus Institute. They don't know about that location. Not yet." Ridge nodded. He would go. Not because he believed it would save the country, or because he thought justice would win in the end, but because Bohl's corpse in the canal deserved more than silence. Because Elodie, haunted as she was, hadn't run when the glass exploded. And because he needed to know, before everything collapsed, whether truth could still be louder than fear. As dawn broke over Delft, soft and cold, the city stirred without knowing how close it had come to forgetting something vital. The truth slept under its cobbled stones, in tunnels and archives, waiting to be found, or buried for good. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. The Haarlem Cipher, page 1. The wind that swept through Haarlem that March afternoon carried more than the scent of river water and bakery smoke. It carried a sense of warning, the kind only the observant could feel. The sudden hush of birdsong, the shiver that ran down one's neck with no cause. Detective Willem Raidmaker stood outside the shuttered antique bookstore on Kruisstraat, coat collar up against the chill, staring at the locked door where just last night an anonymous tip had led to a gunshot, a vanished man, and a trail of blood that ended in nothingness. The sign still read Boak and Beloft, though the promise was clearly broken. The shop's owner, Dieter Van Heel, a former linguist turned recluse, had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a single bullet hole in the back window and a scattering of pages torn from a 17th century volume of encoded Latin. Willem had seen his share of strange things during his years with the Nationale Politie: ritualistic robberies in Rotterdam, political blackmail in Utrecht, and more than a few twisted murders in the underbellies of Amsterdam. But there was something about this case that whispered of old secrets, the kind buried not just by time, but by deliberate hands. Dieter had once been a professor of ancient ciphers, specializing in forgotten dialects and hidden texts used by resistance fighters during the Nazi occupation. He had left academia without warning in the late 90s, citing health reasons, though some whispered of a nervous breakdown following the death of his wife in a fire that had never been properly investigated. Since then, he'd kept to himself, running his obscure bookshop, collecting rare manuscripts, and, according to neighbors, receiving strange late-night visitors who spoke in German, Russian, and sometimes code. Inside the shop, nothing was overtly disturbed. No smashed shelves, no overturned tables. But to Willem, the lack of disorder was suspicious in itself. A man doesn't vanish without a struggle unless he knows his attacker, or unless he's already dead before he hits the floor. The blood droplets, spattered behind the counter and trailing toward the basement stairs, were old enough to be sticky but fresh enough to retain their color. Forensics had already marked them, photographed them, and moved on. But Willem lingered. He knelt near the bottom step, running his hand lightly across the floor. Something gritty. Ash? He raised his fingers to his nose and inhaled. No, not ash. Salt. Unusual. And deliberate. In the basement, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, was a vault, one that hadn't been in the architectural plans of the building. A false wall had been removed the previous evening by crime scene technicians. Inside the vault were rows of drawers, ancient and metal, labeled in archaic Dutch. Most were empty. 2 were locked, and one, now open, contained a book bound in black leather, its cover inscribed with a sequence of numbers: 114.92.17.53. They weren't coordinates, Willem had checked. They weren't Bible verses either, but when arranged differently, they could form a date and time. He wasn't sure why he saw it that way, only that the feeling of meaning was overwhelming. And if he was right, it pointed to something that hadn't happened yet. April 14th, 9:17 p.m. That was 3 weeks from now. He brought the book upstairs and set it under a portable UV lamp. The ink within glowed faintly green. Invisible ink. A spy's trick. The pages were written in a mix of Latin and a cipher Willem didn't recognize, but there were recurring elements, names. Place names: Haarlem, Maastricht, Dresden. Then references to events, blackouts, warehouse fires, museum thefts. Some had already occurred. Some hadn't. One page referred to a location not far from Haarlem, Beverwijk. The date beside it? March 30th, tomorrow. Willem called his colleague and closest friend, Inspector Ilse van Donk, who had worked with him on the infamous Delft art smuggling case years prior. Ilse was cautious but curious, and when he told her about the book, her voice lowered to a near whisper. You remember the Nak Kijker files, don't you? Willem hadn't heard that name in years. Nak Kijker, Night Watcher, was a rumored covert surveillance operation supposedly disbanded in the late 80s, designed to track Soviet operatives through cultural institutions, rare book circles, and language programs. The files had never been released, and the official stance was that the program had never existed. But Dieter Van Heel had reportedly worked with Nak Kijker before he left academia. Willem now suspected the bullet fired in the bookshop had not been intended to kill, but to warn. Or maybe it had missed its mark. He reviewed the surveillance footage from the street across from the shop, but between 2:41 and 2:56 a.m., the feed cut out. Static. Tampering? The timing coincided precisely with the time a nearby witness claimed to have heard a car engine start, followed by silence. He spent the rest of the evening in his flat near the Sparren River, going through Dieter's records, correlating entries from the black leather book with old police files. One theft, a 1999 museum break-in in Cologne, had never been solved. The name V. Reichenbach appeared beside it, a name he'd also seen mentioned in anti-NATO protest files from the 2000s. Reichenbach was a ghost, no photos, no trace, but the name echoed in dissident forums and leaked intelligence documents. If Dieter had information about Reichenbach, that could explain his disappearance. Willem leaned back in his chair, staring out at the Dutch skyline as the bells from the Grote Kerk tolled midnight. Whatever Dieter had discovered, whatever he had unearthed in his decades of quiet obsession, it was enough to draw the attention of someone powerful, someone still watching from the dark corners of Europe's post-Cold War skeletons. Willem knew the next move wasn't to chase shadows in the city. It was to follow the cipher to Beverwijk tomorrow night. Because if the book was right, something was going to happen there, and he intended to be waiting when it did. The night in Beverwijk arrived heavy with moisture and muffled sound, as though the town itself were holding its breath. Detective Willem Raidmaker sat in an unmarked gray Volvo parked outside an abandoned textile warehouse on the edge of the Canal District, the kind of place forgotten by zoning commissions and useful only to those who preferred silence over legality. According to the cipher book, something significant was scheduled for 9:17 p.m., and though Willem still didn't know what, an exchange, a theft, an execution, he knew the location was precise. The building had been condemned for over a decade, its broken windows like gaping eyes, and the alley beside it had been cordoned off years ago after a body was found in its frozen runoff. His watch ticked past 9 o'clock. The street was deserted except for an idling delivery truck 2 blocks down, engine running but headlights off. Willem didn't move yet. Experience had taught him that sometimes surveillance meant waiting until after the appointed moment, when nerves frayed, when people emerged from hiding thinking the threat had passed. At 9:12, a black Mercedes pulled up silently to the warehouse's rear entrance. 2 men got out. One tall, bald, his gait stiff like a former soldier. The other shorter, wiry, with a scarf covering half his face. Willem noted the license plate, fake Belgian registry. He exited his vehicle slowly, keeping to the shadows, weapon drawn but low. As he crept closer, a faint metallic creak reached him, the sound of a loading dock rolling up. Through a crack in the warehouse wall, he saw it. An interior setup that was anything but abandoned. Fluorescent lights buzzed above polished concrete. Several folding tables had been set up in a horseshoe pattern, each holding thin black cases, laptop-sized, and one open container filled with what appeared to be old microfilm reels and coded documents. The bald man was speaking in German, his voice distorted by poor acoustics, but Willem caught several words. Weitergeben, Zurich, Schlüssel. Pass it on. Zurich. Key. The third man appeared then, and Willem's breath caught in his throat. It was Dieter van Heel. Alive, hunched, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded a piece of parchment and placed it into a plastic sleeve. He looked older than Willem remembered from photos, paler, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks, but it was him. The scarfed man asked him something in Russian. Dieter nodded once, then glanced toward the crack in the wall, not at it, but toward it, as if sensing Willem's presence. And that was when the fourth player arrived. A woman, hair tied back, eyes sharp and unblinking. She wasn't part of the group. Her presence shifted the entire dynamic. The bald man reached for his coat as if to draw a weapon, but she raised her hand and spoke in clear Dutch. No more games. The cipher is compromised. We shut it down now. Chaos bloomed. The scarfed man lunged for one of the cases. Dieter yelled something unintelligible, and Willem, fearing a massacre, kicked in the side door and fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The fluorescent lights flickered violently. In that moment, as figures scattered and shouted in half a dozen languages, Willem saw Dieter crouch low, grab something from beneath the table, and slide it across the floor toward him. A metal cylinder, ancient-looking, sealed with brass bands etched with more numerical codes. Willem caught it just as the scarfed man pulled a knife and charged. A struggle followed, rough, fast, punctuated by crashing plastic and Dieter screaming, "Don't let it fall into Reichenbach's hands!" Willem managed to fire a shot into the attacker's leg, dropping him instantly. But the woman was gone. The Mercedes peeled away from the warehouse seconds later, its tires screeching as it vanished into the mist. Ilse arrived with backup 5 minutes later, sirens muted at Willem's request. The scene was secure, but the damage was done. Dieter, bleeding from the temple, was taken into protective custody. The scarfed man, a known courier for Eastern European artifact rings, would not speak a word, not even his name. The warehouse was filled with fragments, stolen documents, partial cipher wheels, and photos of Cold War agents long presumed dead. But most disturbing of all were the dossiers, a dozen slim files, each labeled with a city and date. One was Den Haag, 2013. Another, Milan, 2014. The last, Utrecht, 2025. Willem stared at the pages, heart thudding. These weren't crimes of the past, they were predictions. And if the cipher book was right about Beverwijck, then it might be right about all of them. Later that night, alone in his Haarlem flat, Willem opened the brass cylinder. Inside was a thin roll of film, a flash drive, and a note in Dieter's handwriting. What began in 1944 was never truly ended. The night watchers kept the light alive, but now the shadows grow again. Protect the cipher. Burn what you must. Willem turned the note over. On the back was the same number sequence from the book. But now there was a final line. Not all ciphers are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be survived. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. The first body surfaced in the Vliet Canal at dawn, face down, caught in the reeds near Leiden's southern edge where the water thins and the fog rolls in thick as wool, swallowing sound and scent and memory. Peter Voss, captain of the local politie and a man of quiet rituals, was called from his cramped attic flat above a cheese shop by a constable too young to shave properly and too pale to disguise what he had seen. They met at the towpath, where a police skiff bobbed against the concrete embankment and a coroner crouched in silence. The victim was male, late 40s, dressed in an outdated wool suit, one shoe missing, and a silver money clip still clutched in his right hand, untouched by the currents, which meant he hadn't been there long. But the real puzzle wasn't the bruising around the neck, nor the precise incision behind the left ear, which would later be found to have excised a coin-sized piece of skin with surgical precision. It was what was etched into his shoulder blade, just under the collar, an ancient symbol burned into the flesh, almost calligraphic, like an alchemical rune or the tail end of a forgotten coat of arms. Voss had seen something like it before, back in 1999 when he was stationed in The Hague, dealing with strange disappearances tied to Cold War archives and underground auctions of Nazi relics. The case had been buried faster than it had surfaced, sealed and passed upward, way above his rank. But this was no copycat. The canal was closed off, cordons put in place, divers sent down to search for anything tossed in panic or ritual, and Voss began his canvass through the old alleys of Leiden, a town that wore its history like armor, its Renaissance facades hiding secrets older than the country itself. The locals had little to say, though a bartender near Hogewoord swore he saw a man matching the victim's description 2 nights earlier speaking French and drinking Oud Genever as if trying to forget something. Voss had the glass tested, trace elements of a powdered compound found on the rim, identified by lab techs in The Hague as a synthetic stimulant used during World War II by Allied spies to stay awake for 72-hour stretches. It hadn't been manufactured in decades. That same day, Voss received an envelope at his office. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a photograph of a building he recognized instantly. A centuries-old warehouse near Delft, abandoned since the 1980s after a fire gutted its eastern wing. On the back of the photo was a single line, typed on real carbon ribbon. The library is never closed. Beneath that, a time, 3:47 a.m. Voss understood immediately. This was no ordinary homicide. It was part of something deeper, older. He called only one person, Dr. Ilona Terras-Felt, a semi-retired linguist who had once worked for NATO as a cryptographic consultant. She had helped him years ago decode a string of messages left in 17th century ledgers smuggled through The Hague. Messages that later led to the arrest of a member of the Dutch parliament involved in relic trafficking. Ilona arrived at dusk with her bag of dusty reference books and a mind sharp as a scalpel. She studied the photograph, then the symbol burned into the dead man's flesh, and nodded grimly. "You're looking at a mark belonging to the Delft's protocol," she said, as if naming a ghost. "It predates modern intelligence services. Formed in the aftermath of the 80 Years' War, they operated in shadows, scholars, assassins, and archivists. Their job wasn't just to gather intelligence, but to remove knowledge that could destabilize empires." Voss felt the weight of her words settle into his ribs. He had read about the protocol in conspiracy forums and academic footnotes, usually dismissed as myth or misattributed Freemason legendary. But Ilona was convinced. They never disbanded, just went deeper. The Cold War reignited some of their operations. They were seen active in Prague, Berlin, even Lyon. And now here. Voss knew what he had to do. At exactly 3:20 a.m., he stood alone outside the scorched ruin in Delft, flashlight off, pistol drawn, coat collar turned up against the cold. At 3:46, a light flickered inside the second-floor window, brief, controlled. He entered through a side grate, stepping over fallen beams and cracked tile mosaics that once adorned the floor. On the upper level, dust coated every surface, except for one table, freshly cleared, on which sat a thick folder marked only with a seal, a lion flanked by twin keys. Inside were photographs, grainy images of politicians, priests, and judges, all standing with the same man, the victim found in the Vliet Canal. But in these photos, dated between 1995 and 2010, the victim looked exactly the same. No aging, no change. Voss felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. At the bottom of the file was a list. 37 names. 5 of them already crossed out in red. The 6th name read, Peter Voss. Voss stood in the flickering shadows of the burned-out Delft warehouse, his fingers trembling as they gripped the file. 37 names. His was the 6th, written in clean black ink, yet already underlined in red. The panic bloomed slow and cold in his gut, not because he was marked, but because he didn't understand why. He had never delved into anything of consequence, not in the way these people had. The others on the list were men and women with access, leverage, buried histories. A justice minister, a Vatican attaché, 2 members of the EU Counterintelligence Bureau, and Voss, a mid-rank officer with a long memory and a record too clean to be left out in the open. He left the warehouse with the file hidden beneath his coat, his mind reeling with one thought. Someone was culling witnesses, not enemies. This was no vendetta, it was a cleanup. Back in Leiden by morning, he locked the file in a false panel behind his radiator and called Ilona. She answered on the 2nd ring, and her voice was laced with tension even before he spoke. "They know you opened it," she said. Voss didn't ask how she knew. He simply asked what came next. Ilona told him to meet her in Utrecht, near the crypt of St. Martin's Cathedral, where old tunnels once used by resistance fighters during World War II were rumored to intersect with something much older. "They'll expect you to run," she said. "Don't. Walk straight in." Voss arrived at dusk, wearing a borrowed coat and carrying a decoy folder filled with random files from his office. The cathedral loomed over the square like a tombstone for a forgotten empire. Inside, a choir sang softly in Latin while tourists trickled along the edges like ghosts. Ilona was waiting near a side chapel, eyes sharp, a small black device in her hand. "Signal blocker," she said before he asked. "They've tracked you for days, not through your phone, through the badge you wear." Voss dropped his police ID into the holy water font without hesitation. They passed through a concealed door in the sacristy, down stone steps carved before Napoleon ever set foot on Dutch soil. The tunnel opened into a vaulted chamber lined with rusted gates and crumbling Latin inscriptions. In the far corner, guarded by a sealed iron grate, sat a collection of artifacts, not catalogued, not labeled. Ilona knelt and pulled a small wooden box from beneath the stones. Inside was a scroll, wrapped in waxed linen and sealed with the same twin key symbol. "This is what they're trying to erase," she said. The scroll contains the location of a lost archive, one compiled during the Reformation by agents embedded across Europe. It details betrayals, identities, coded accounts, names that were never supposed to survive history. The man in the canal, he was their last carrier. Voss tried to process it all. The murder, the symbol, the centuries of secrecy. And now the realization that this wasn't about relics or revenge, but information so volatile it could burn governments to the ground. He asked why now, why the resurgence after so long in hiding. Ilona's answer chilled him. Because someone else is close, and the protocol doesn't share. They only erase. As if on cue, a low tremor passed through the chamber. The stone above the stairwell cracked, and a sharp, echoing report rang out, gunfire. Voss pulled Ilona down, drawing his sidearm as the grate behind them exploded inward. 2 figures entered, masked, moving with military precision. Voss fired once, hit the lead man in the thigh. The second dropped a flash charge that turned the world to light and ringing silence. When Voss recovered, Ilona was gone. Only the scroll remained, unburned, untouched. The attackers had vanished. Back in Leiden, Voss found his apartment gutted. Everything of value was missing, except the file, which he had hidden behind the radiator. It was still there. That meant one thing. The men in the crypt hadn't been protocol. Voss had stumbled into a turf war. There was another faction at play, one with different methods, perhaps even different goals. He drove to The Hague under cover of night and met an old contact at the International Criminal Court, a man named Bastian Coers, who once worked with MI6 and had since turned analyst for Interpol. Bastian reviewed the file in silence, frowning only when he reached the photographs. "I've seen him before," he said. "Only not in person, in archives." The same man appeared at a diplomatic event in West Berlin in 1972, then again in Belgrade in '89. No passport, no name, same face. Voss asked if the photos could be fake. Bastian shook his head. "These aren't just images. They're part of a pattern." He explained that over the last 50 years, there had been a series of leaks within intelligence communities that always coincided with appearances of this figure. Leaks that never made the public eye, but resulted in the quiet resignations of high-ranking officials. "He wasn't just a courier," Bastian said. "He was the archive." Voss realized then what Alona meant. The man was never meant to age because he was never meant to live in daylight. His death had triggered something. A dead vault had opened, and now both sides were racing to close it permanently. Voss took the scroll and the file and vanished into Friesland, renting a boat and slipping through the silent lakes and reeds, out of reach of cameras and satellites. He would find the archive first. He would bring it to light. Not because he believed in justice anymore, but because once your name is on a list like that, you only have two choices: burn it all down or wait your turn. And Peter Voss had never been good at waiting.